Hey my watchers, welcome. Today we are gonna see, what if Harry Potter was famous wizard in Gotham City? Join Patreon for early access exclusive content of Super Op stories. Also contents that's too far for YouTube. You will get 400 content there, please do check that too. Please subscribe this channel, because definitely I will try my best to provide a valuable content for you all. Also check the description to support the original author for this beautiful creation. The night sky was exceptionally clear, revealing thousands of glittering stars far above the remote temple that sat atop the steep cliff face. Modeled after the famous Taj Mahal in India, it was a mix of smooth round roofs with jutting points and tall archways. It had been colored in a mix of fresh crisp white and dark green that matched the few well-placed trees within a remote garden. All in all, it blended in well and hardly looked like a creation of man if looked at from the ground. With its placing as well as the large arching mountains that stood near it, the temple was ideally placed as a hideout. Soft amber light could be seen emitting from within, looking almost like fire if looked at from an adjoining mountain. It shone brightest from the east side, tall arching windows that led out onto a large overhanging balcony. They easily revealed a large room, colored in warm mahogany and soft subtle creams. Many bookcases lined the wall, holding well-worn novels and ancient-looking scrolls that had been carefully placed to reduce chances of damage. To one side sat a side desk before a large leather wingback chair that held a large stack of paperwork and a series of smaller and more present-looking books. A few writing implements such as pens and a fine feather quill along with a small pot of ink sat neatly in the center. A half-finished letter written on old parchment laid next to them. Throughout the large room were a series of dark marble pillars that matched the floor, extending and keeping that old-fashioned look. The only other furniture of the room were a pair of high-back leather chairs that sat near an open fire that was set into one of the adjoining walls, a series of paintings lining the others. They ranged in detail and quality, from well-made grassy meadows to what could only be described as blobs and squiggles of color. The most impressive hung above the fire and was a long vertical piece of a man with black hair lined with white, sharp hard green eyes and a carefully kept pointed goatee. He was dressed in a midnight suit. A white neckerchief proudly sat round his neck. His shoulders were hidden beneath a deep green cloak held securely by a thin golden cord that ran between two intricate clasps. He was standing straight and firm with what appeared to be perfect posture, his hands before him as he held the handle of a long blade that came to just below his waistline, the curved blade resting against the barely notable floor. All in all, it was a very intimidating image that appeared to be carefully observing the room, threatening any would-be trespassers with its unwavering gaze. Standing before the large arching windows was a matching figure lacking only the sword. Instead, a golden goblet holding the fine red wine was held by a slowly tightening hand. Anger tightened the grip and the goblet shook slightly, the figure's eyes narrowing menacingly on his own reflection, oblivious to the wondrous view within his gaze. This man was none other than the esteemed Ra's al Ghul, known to many as the Demon Heads and the leader of a terrorist group known as the League of Assassins. And he was currently angry. No scratch that, he was furious. Behind him, the sole other occupant of the room, a man known as Cecil, barely restrained a tremble of fear as he stared warily at his master's back. He felt a chill run down his spine but knew it wasn't from the cold, definitely not with the roaring fire that warmed the room to a comfortable temperature. His body keeping itself restrained beneath a dark gray robe over which he wore a thick black cloak that ended just below his knees. His short black hair shifted slightly as his coal eyes flickered nervously between the man before him and the wooden clipboard he held within his hands. Suddenly there was a light clatter as the goblet hit the floor, spilling its contents, the liquid quickly spreading and catching the bottom of the green cloak. Raz paid it no mind, instead narrowing his eyes and snarling slightly, "I should never have allied myself with a madman." Outskirts of Sarajevo, January 13th, 23:45 EA. The cool, crisp air burned his lungs, as the cold burned into his skin, leaving his limbs aching and numb. The scenery whipped past him, the snow-covered ground blending and hiding old discarded brick and old abandoned cars. They looked almost skeletal, like the buildings he was approaching. He was traveling at what would most definitely be deadly speeds should he crash, his cape whipping wildly behind him. Still, it wasn't fast enough. With that thought, his thumb pressed firmly against the gear, accelerating the speed and engaging the boosters. The screen before him flashed, showing the increase in acceleration. The back tire caught up clouds of snow and dust, leaving a large trail behind him. East Asia, January 13th, 1747 EA. His back was rigid and fists clenched tight as he turned away from his reflection, no longer able to stand the sight of himself. His eyes met those of Cecil, the man looking extremely intimidated even as he held Ra's gaze. Raz didn't hesitate and started to move closer, his mouth already moving as questions. Half-formed plans and panic set in and mingled with the already bubbling pit of anger. Where are they? Even so, his steps were measured, watching as Cecil flipped the front page over the clipboard, his eyes quickly scanning the contents even as he answered, "In Sarajevo, sir." Suddenly his lip curled into a small worried frown, and his voice hitched, and he glanced at Raz briefly before closing his eyes, regret coloring his features before he once more met his master's gaze. Seeing this, Raz paused, a frown of his own already forming before the words left his subordinate's lips. "He has the boy."
Sarajevo,
January 13th, 2347 EA. Ugh, the small murmur escaped the boy's lips even as he perched precariously on his knees, eyes fixed on the ground before him, before shutting, attempting to block out the sheer agony. His teeth were tightly grit together and felt like they would shatter if he applied any more pressure, his wrists straining against the tight pair of handcuffs that were working to cut the blood flow off from his hands. They lacked their initial strength now, and it felt more like a chore than desperation as he tried to ignore the fact that most of his body felt numb, and that he could barely move his fingers. Disheveled bangs shifted to fall limply over his forehead as he weakly lifted his head, forcing his eyes to open, revealing a pair of pale green that spoke of nothing but pain. The left was only partially revealed, and the white backdrop stained a slight pink, the bruising around it revealing that it was swelling and soon would be worse than useless. He tried to ignore such pessimistic thoughts, thinking such things, no matter how probable or true, would not help his current situation in the least. Knowing with all his heart that he was probably going to die didn't really help either. Jason, however, had always been a mixture of optimism and cynicism, so even in the bleakest situation he still held out hope. No matter how small, Bruce will come. He always comes. With that thought firmly on repeat in his head, he met the gaze of his tormentor. He barely registered those sickly reddish hues before the firm bite of metal met his jaw, knocking him from his precarious position, even as a cry of pain wrenched from his lips, a series of coughing following close behind. The cold concrete floor was harsh and firmly dug into his shoulder as he lay there trying to ignore the pain, trying not to give the sick bastard the satisfaction even if it meant looking weak. As a result, his eyes were shut tightly once more, and he could feel those eyes on him again, looking over his tattered uniform like someone examined a fine piece of art. His cape, or what was left of it, was tattered beyond repair, the once proud green and yellow seemingly dulled to match the mood. His gloves were gone, leaving his hands bare and vulnerable to the cuffs which had already cut through his wrists enough that a thin trickle of blood was running over his right hand, slightly warming the fingers. His boots had also been taken, thought his ankles were left free of restraint. Not like that helped much. He had tried kicking out earlier and had been rewarded with a sharp blow to the leg. He had heard a snap and felt a sharp pain that he was positive belonged to a break of some kind. His mask had been subjected to a knife, his tormentor finding pleasure apparently in having a blade so close that he could gorge the younger's eyes out if he so chose to. Jason had been sure that he would, however the madman had just removed the white lenses that usually covered his eyes and then withdrew the knife. Why he didn't just pull the mask off altogether, Jason didn't know. But then again, there wasn't any true knowing when it came to this clown. Now his pained green eyes were vulnerable to the psychopath through its tattered remains. The rest of his costume had held up well but was beginning to wear, odd rips appearing where he had been struck or the material feeling odd as though it had moved where it shouldn't. His belt was still there. He had woken up believing that Joker had made a fatal mistake and that he could easily escape before whatever traps the clown had set up went off, only to be disappointed and near downright sick when he had discovered it was empty, all his hidden weapons, all his hope having been stripped from him. It was a cruel joke, and one that had struck home his situation better than Joker and his crowbar were doing. He was trapped, he had no way to escape, and all his contingency and backup plans were gone. And now he had no way to even contact Bruce, he had no way to escape.
No.
He'll come. He always comes. Wow, that looked like it really hurt, came the cruel jeer, the voice sounding morbidly curious rather than outright vicious. Jason didn't need his open to know that Joker was enjoying this. As shut they remained stubbornly shut as he attempted to slow his breathing. It didn't really work as his chest heaved large amounts of oxygen as though the air itself would somehow save him. It actually hurt to breathe this hard, without the additional aches from his injuries. Almost like a sixth sense, Jason felt danger and opened his good eye slightly, barely suppressing the shudder that ran through him as Joker slowly smiled his cruel, arrogant grin. Yellow teeth peeking over the garish red bottom lip. The arm slowly raising with the tool clutched tightly. Jason shut his eyes, not wanting to watch. He grunted as the metal struck home on his left shoulder this time, swiftly followed by another blow that grasped another cry from the boy that echoed through the abandoned warehouse. The dark atmosphere that was barely visible even with the overhanging lights didn't help. The empty crates and boxes stacked up against the walls were just as useless. And the door was so far away. As the next blow landed, he heard another crack, and now it was even harder to breathe if possible. His body reeling landed him on his back, the light catching his uniform and the dull R on his chest. He didn't notice as he twisted his head to the right, desperately trying to draw in breath as his chest insistently burned, this pain becoming more prominent than any other. His eyes staring fiercely at the vaulted beam ceiling above him, slight cough of blood that was crawling up his airway blurring his vision slightly as he did so, the limp black bangs hanging annoyingly in front. Now hang on, suddenly a silhouetted figure loomed above the overhanging lights, casting his top half in shadow. And when coupled with his currently failing vision, Jason had no chance of viewing this figure. Not that he actually needed to. He knew the Joker by heart, and he certainly would never forget the man after this. That is, if he lived. He's coming. He's coming. Just a little bit longer. That looked like it hurt a lot more. That crude voice spoke once more. Its harsh edge and open amusement brought the man's face to mind, even as Jason fought to replace it with another. The styled green hair that formed a peak above the middle of the forehead, sweeping back and looking nothing but toxic and sickly. The pale as a vampire white skin that made you question how this thing could actually walk around in the daylight without burning to a fiery crisp. The crimson lips, which looked like he drank the blood of his victims, made it look like that cruel grinning jaw was always smiling and leaking blood. And the eyes, oh God, the eyes. They were a murky red and like his lips screamed blood. They often sparkled with cruel amusement as well as misplaced mirth. The normal white ball was stained an eerie yellow and outlined by coal circles which only accentuated them all the more. It was like looking into the depths of hell and having no way to escape, no way to get away from what was most certainly the devil in human form. This creature that basked itself in purple suits with orange and green, mocking the very idea of an icon originally created to bring joy. There was no way it could be human. When Jason had initially started his career as Robin, he had believed, like all children, that the world was very black and white. There was good and evil. You were evil if you chose to do a bad thing, and as a result you had to be taken down. Then he had been introduced to the rogues, and he had quickly learned that it wasn't just good and evil, it wasn't just choice that defined the individuals. But then again, like almost everything, even that was tossed away when he met the Joker. At least with the others you could get a handle on why they were possibly acting the way they were, why they chose to keep being villains even after they lost. With Joker it seemed to simply be that he liked to annoy Batman, and that was his one singular motive. Well, that, and possibly because he was an attention whore, and one that was very dangerous when not given what he wanted and equally as dangerous when he had it. He was cruel, sadistic even to those who worked for him, held a crude humor and enjoyed watching others suffer even over the tiniest of mistakes. He was for all intents and purposes the embodiment of evil. He had no true overall goal, and in his own words he was simply ahead of the curve. And Jason had never hated anyone as much as he hated this man right now. This man that was slowly beating him to death. A slight tapping caught his attention as he stared up weakly, the gray of the ceiling blurring with the shadows. Slowly his eyes drifted shut as the aching pain shot through his limbs. His mind faintly noting the uncomfortable way his cape had twisted below him along with the numbness of both his arms. So, let's clear this up. Okay, Pumpkin? Again the cruel voice spoke out, sending an uncontrollable shudder through the boy. his breathing becoming slightly more labored as he anticipated what would come next. Bruce, what hurts more? Please. The rhythm of tapping suddenly stopped and the cruel jaunt followed it. He didn't need to see to know Joker was drawing back for another blow. Another shot of agony. His ribs this time forcing a grunt from his frozen lips. Hurry, or be. Another blow, this one catching his lower spine where he had turned on his side, sending a fierce ripple that resulted in a full-body shudder, involuntarily jerking all of his injuries and leaving his mind clouded. Don't. Forehand? His face was abused once more and he felt a tooth loosen, more blood filling his mouth to trail down his chin, the rest remaining with its awful copper taste in his mouth, the taste furthering an approaching feeling of nausea and making him almost choke. Leave, or backhand. Another full body shudder and he was falling to lay on his front, his feet uselessly jerking, his leg announcing its dissatisfaction with the situation. He was coughing again, the blood that had started to pool splattering before his face as he jerked and jerked, shuddering in pain. Me! Another hit. More lancing pain and a brief blindness through his skull. Bruce, please. A cruel laugh echoed from behind, but he couldn't open his eyes. It hurt too much. Breathing was extremely painful and everything was slowly shutting off. Darkness encroaching on him as Weekly tried to break the cuffs once more. He could barely feel his hands. Where was Bruce? Where was his hero? His right eye slowly opened, the left feeling too heavy to even try. Had he left him to just like his father? No, Bruce wouldn't leave him, Bruce wouldn't abandon him. He was his partner, his friend, and if only secretly the man Jason had always pictured as a true father. Bruce wouldn't leave him. Bruce was coming. He would not give up. He would not let this sick freak steal the only thing he had left. He's coming. And I'm not going to give up. The laughter was still echoing behind him. Ignoring the roaring heat that sprung from the simple action, Jason shifted so that he was looking at Joker with his right eye. He's coming for me. He had intended to state this confidently, to tell the clown just how screwed he would be once Bruce got here. How Bruce would take that damn crowbar, and how he would beat the Joker's brains in as payback for Jason. How when Bruce was finished the clown would beg for death, for forgiveness, for someone to save him like Jason was doing now. Unfortunately, the blood in his mouth and his labored breathing only allowed a small muttered mumble that wasn't decipherable to even his own ears. Still, he narrowed his single eye, hoping that the message could be relayed through his green orbs alone. The murmur, while not successful in translating his threat, caught the maniac's attention, and that haunting cackle finally came to a stop. The clown's head, which had been tilted backward, came down to focus on the defiant gaze. Suddenly the clown was kneeling over him, his own face to close for comfort. Jason sneered slightly at this, his nose screwing up slightly from the smell of cheap cologne that was coming from that god-awful suit. Ugh, Jason sneered further as the clown's breath wafted over him, reminding him of the smell of a corpse, even as the Joker continued to mock his ailed threat. A little louder, lamb chop. Suddenly the hand that had been positioned next to Joker's own head as he mocked, attempting to hear. Suddenly the hand was grasping his hair and mockingly rubbing his sweat-stained locks, the touch far too rough and condescending to offer even the slightest comfort. I think you might have a collapsed lung. That always impedes the auditory, was the matter-of-fact statement the clown provided, that cruel smile tugging at the corner of his lips. In that moment Jason decided one thing. He would rather have Joker beating him with that bloody crowbar than be in this proximity with the clown. At least there the torture was only physical. As a result, he lifted his head from where it had been resting against the cool concrete, and spat a mouthful of blood in the clown face. For a moment they both froze, Jason in open defiance and a small amount of fear as he waited for the inevitable reaction. The Joker, on the other hand, had frozen in surprise, his eyes widening almost comically as though he didn't understand, hand stilling in its movement. Then just as quickly the eyes had narrowed and the hand roughly tugged Jason's head back by the hair, so that it was at an angle which made him believe that it was about to snap, before being forcefully pushed forward. His head collided once more with the unyielding ground and he heard an audible crunch and felt a blossoming of heat from his nose. The fact that he now couldn't breathe through it, as well as the building pain, informed him that the cartilage had snapped. He grunted and twisted, trying to ignore the fact that it felt like he was now struggling to just draw breath. The clown released him sneering as he stood up once more to glare down at him, sneering as his gloved hand fished inside the purple blazer for a handkerchief. Now that was rude, he stated as he pulled the white cotton cloth free of the inside pocket. The first boy blunder had some manners. The clown had stated this with disapproval, as if he was telling off a teen for forgetting to use his manners. His eyes narrowing, anger sparking behind the crimson orbs. He quickly used the cloth and started dabbing it against the bloody spittle still clinging to his face. Jason, who had been still facing the floor trying to breathe, twisted once more so that his face was looking at the clown who stood a few feet behind him. He groaned as it hurt to do so, but it was worth it to see the reaction he had earned for his daring actions. He chose to finish his silent insult with a large toothy grin, some of blood pooling out of the corner of his mouth as he did so. Joker chose a disappointed look as a response, his eyes returning to normal, or what could be considered normal for the clown, as he finished wiping away the spit, returning the handkerchief to where it had originated. He sighed before speaking, his voice matching the look. I suppose I'll have to teach you a lesson so you can better follow in his footsteps. Here he paused and appeared to be thinking to himself as he looked briefly towards the ceiling before returning his gaze to Jason. Nah. He replied to his own query before a grin broke out on his face, rocking forward slightly while bringing his arm up once more. I'm just going to keep beating you with this crowbar, he said with humor, haunting laughter following as he placed his foot on his victim's back to keep him from moving away. Jason grunted slightly as his chest screamed at being pushed against the hard floor, more blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as he stared up at his tormentor. The clown had reared his head back once more and wasn't restraining himself in any way. It sent an involuntary shiver up the boy's spine as he watched. His moment of rebellion hadn't done anything, and the clown would continue on as before, if not even more aggressively. If he kept this up, no, Jason would hold on, he just had to wait a little longer. He could do this, the clown wouldn't win. Bruce would make sure he didn't. Resolved to endure the no doubt painful session with the clown, Jason shut his eyes in determination. East Asia, January 13th, 1750 EA. Roz slowly walked back towards the window as dread gripped tightly at his heart. He hadn't meant for this to happen. The clown had been intended to be a simple distraction, not a danger. Now he had put the detective's son in possibly mortal peril, something he had never intended to do. He had one spy within Sarajevo that had been there to observe how the clown worked, and if it would be worth hiring him in the future. Now he knew that he should never have hired him in the first place. Even if he sent word now, it would be too late for the spy to do anything, and he couldn't recall his forces for the same reason. No, there was only one hope now. Where is the detective? He questioned, hoping his aide would provide him with some good news, something to keep him from being confronted with the dreary truth of his actions. He's on his way. Roz almost smiled at that, however he caught sight of Cecil in the reflection and the downcast expression he wore on his face. The sadness and pity nor being lost by the cool glass. Sarajevo, January 13th, 2350 EA. The bike nearly skidded as he recklessly weaved it around corners and in and out of the way of debris that had been left by the recent bombing. The bike roared loudly down the empty streets, passing the skeletal bodies of what had once been cars and the empty, hauntingly dark buildings that lined said streets. Pieces of barbed wire from fallen fences and wood as well as brick became annoyances that would have fallen any other bike. However, the Batcycle, which had been made for tough terrain, kept traction on the heavily snow-lined road and traversed them without even slowing. Batman noticed none of this, his eyes remaining fixed before him as he looked between the screen which showed Jason's location through the small tracer he had secretly placed on the boy's belt. He was getting closer, but he had been too long. Why had he been so amateur as to let that clown knock him out? Now Joker had Jason, and God knows what he was doing to the boy. If what he had done to Barbara was any indicator, it would be anything but pleasant. He needed to hurry, but he was already pushing the bike to its limit. He ignored the harsh chill of the air that attacked the exposed chin and lower part of his face. Ignored how the bike was shaking almost violently below him from how far he was pushing its engine. He ignored how his fear and instincts screamed at him to slow down, and at how reckless he was shooting off without so much as a helmet for safety. These were inconsequential thoughts to him. Jason was in danger. His son was in danger, and he was going to kill Joker if he had so much as laid a wrong hand on the boy. East Asia, January 13th, 1751 EA. But sir, he'll never make it there in time. Cecil's voice echoed like a condemning behind him. The sadness it held for a boy the man had never met and the brilliant detective who had proved a worthy adversary. Unconsciously Ra's fists clenched tightly at his sides as sadness encroached upon him. His eyes shutting as once again his own reflection became unbearable to look at. What have I done?
Sarajevo.
January 13th, 2354 EA. He was getting closer to the edge of the city and the streets were unfortunately getting harder to travel with the amount of debris that had fallen from the buildings. He almost growled as he turned onto the next street. The road had been completely blocked off by pieces of scaffolding and barbed wire that looked like it had fallen from a base of some kind. He didn't slow down as he spotted a piece lying at a vertical angle, instead speeding up. He didn't have time to find another way, he needed to hurry. With that thought, he waited until the beam was only a few narrow feet away before acting the bike's booster once more, giving it an extra boost of speed which carried both him and it clear over the block and to the other side. Thankfully it was much clearer and a few of the street lamps were still working, helping him navigate a lot easier than he had been. If he continued up this road then he would come to the edge and where Jason was waiting. Come on, faster, he thought to himself as he tried to pull more speed out of the bike. I'm coming, Jason, just hold on a little longer.
Strishka.
The door opened with a small groan from the rusted hinges, the bottom scraping slightly against the concrete floor as it did so. Not that Joker minded or even noticed for that matter, as he was busy fussing with his bow tie which had become crooked while he was working. Okay kiddo, I gotta go, he called out as he walked out the open door, pausing just beyond the threshold, as he playfully looked behind into the darkened warehouse. It's been fun though, right? He questioned, his gleeful eyes falling onto the bloody battered body of a boy, the red shining eerily in the dark lighting. He was lay on his side. The body was still, small amounts of blood splatter surround it. Well, continued Joker as if the boy had replied, maybe a smidge more fun for me than you. As he was talking he started to pull on his thick woolen coat, preparing to depart and leave his work for the bat. As he finished he busied himself with adjusting his sleeves which had bunched slightly over his blazer, continuing on with his one-sided conversation as he did so. I'm just guessing since you're being awful quiet. As he finished with the sleeves, he moved to pull at the coat opening, pulling it more securely over his shoulders as he did so. Anyway, here he pointed at the boy as though he was talking to a favored nephew, advising him to behave with a cruel smile. Be a good boy, finish your homework and be in bed by 9. No reaction. The boy's body lay as still as ever, which had the clown smiling all the wider as he carefully observed him. Unfortunately, the boy's hair was falling in his face, which was positioned downwards, keeping him from seeing the no doubt pained expression. Unperturbed, the clown continued, and hey. Suddenly his voice dropped from the mocking parental tone to a much more chilling velvet. Please tell the big man I said. He paused, pulling his fur hood over his head. Hello. His chilling cackle rang out again as he pulled the door shut with a light bang, the laughter still traveling through the thin metal. An eyelid slowly pulled back to reveal pained green as the laugh gradually faded, the head twisting slightly to look at the closed door. He's gone. He rolled onto his back, moaning as he did so at the sheer agony from pretty much every part of his body, which was currently demanding that he never move again. His hair fell back and out of his face as he shut his eyes and soldiered on. He couldn't stay here. He needed to move. Moaning once more, he rolled backwards and slowly brought his cuffed hands down so that he could slip them under his feet. It was painful but served its purpose, as his hands were now in front of him, giving him a better orientation and a better chance of defending himself if the clown came back. He had managed to get the madman to lose interest by playing dead on his last few blows, forcing himself to remain still and make no noise or give reaction. It was extremely difficult, however, it had worked. A few more blows and he might have actually been dead. Grunting, he used his newly positioned hands to push himself from the floor, swaying dangerously as he did so. His legs, particularly the right, were screaming, and he was overtaken by a sense of nausea as the red-hot agony lanced through him. He tried to ignore it, gritting his teeth tightly together as he carefully took a step forward. The pain was too much and he fell forward onto his front, what was left of his cape draping over his fallen form as he groaned, his face coming close to meeting the concrete once more. He took only a few seconds to recover before he moved his arms once more, pushing with his leg as he did so. He was now balanced on his elbow as his eyes, the left heavily swollen at this point, locked on the door. Determination fueled him, and suddenly he was dragging himself using his arms and a little help from his legs. It was a painful process, and he could feel every shift of his ribs as he did so, making moan in pain with each movement as a small trickle of blood followed trail created earlier in the night at the corner of his mouth.
Stříška, stříška.
The engine was purring down the wheels, barely keeping traction as he weaved in and out. Finally the road cleared and he could see the end of the city. His hands, numb from how tightly they were gripping the accelerator, barely caught his attention as he looked down at the bike screen. The tracer was just 60 feet away. Looking up, he saw a steep hill on top of which an old warehouse stood alone. The headlights next to it were ablaze, and he could make out its shabby appearance even as he carefully climbed. "I'm here, Jason. Just one more minute."
Stříška, stříška.
He stopped at this, mentally cursing the Joker who had probably chained or padlocked it shut before leaving. So he wasn't as fooled as Jason had thought. Despair suddenly made itself known as he released the handle and slid down the door with a small grunt, his limbs feeling numb and useless. Moaning slightly, he forced himself to turn around and angrily placed his back against the cool metal. Pain shot through his chest and he gripped it with his left hand. He leaned his head back, taking a deep breath like Bruce had taught him to do in such situations, trying to think what he could possibly do. This was a warehouse. It may have more than one exit, or possibly something he could use on the door in one of the many boxes scattered around the place. Right, he needed to look around if he could. Suddenly his eyes flew open as he heard a beeping from somewhere in front of him. They widened in disbelief as they spotted a large timer attached to what appeared to be 30 sticks of dynamite a few feet away to his right. The timer showed a large 9, and that sense of dread and despair suddenly became all the more prominent. He watched as it slowly counted down, feeling his hope drain away. 8. He leaned back, allowing his back to rest against the door. 7. His swollen eyes shut, leaving him with his right to watch. His mouth thinned, a trickle of blood still flowing from the corner. 5. The despair and fear suddenly transformed into acceptance, and he took a slow, deep breath, knowing it would probably be his last. 4. Memories started to surface before his eyes. He watched with a sense of nostalgia and longing. 3. He was crying as his father left after having beaten him once more, off to see some mob boss about a new job, leaving Jason to carefully nurse his bruises. His whole life on the street after he ran away, the night he stole a pair of tires that lead him to the man who would give him a new life. 2. Alfred smiling and laughing as he paraded around the cave in his first Robin costume, yellow cape proudly adorning his small shoulders. Bruce's warm laugh as he made a clever comeback or insult about a villain they were chasing. A laugh only he, Dick, and Alfred could bring out. A life as a hero, jumping across rooftops and saving the day, inspiring and protecting those he saved. A life as a normal child, going to school and making friends. 1. His eyes shut, and only one thought now went through his mind. Bruce!
Stříška, stříška.
The bike pulled a slight wheelie as it briefly lost contact with the ground, the hill unsteady under the heavy snow. Bruce didn't notice as he jumped from the bike, letting it fall behind him as he landed at the top in a crouch. He didn't pause as he sprinted toward the warehouse only a few feet away. "I'm here, Jason." Boom! He was sent flying backwards as the building exploded, fire and debris flying in every direction even as the shock wave sent Bruce stumbling backwards. He barely pulled his cape around him in time as a piece of the roof collided with him, knocking him off his feet. He felt his back collide harshly with a large rock. His front assaulted further as the same piece of roof landed on top of him. Forcing himself to his knees, he pushed the thankfully light metal off of himself and pushed himself to his feet, looking round as dread crept in. The surrounding area was a mess of fire and pieces of the warehouse, only small pieces of the brick walls still standing. Looking around almost desperately, he ran off into the mess, looking for anything that could be Jason. "Please be all right. Please be all right." He was mentally begging even as he searched, pushing pieces of roof and old boxes out of the way as he moved around, noting the large hole in the floor where the bomb had probably been placed. He looked down, but saw nothing other than earth and a few pieces of metal. Moving away to the right, he suddenly caught a dark red a few feet away, His feet were moving before he even realized it. Once close enough, he skidded to his knees and hurriedly moved a heavy wooden beam that had fallen from the roof. Tossing it once he had it moving enough. Using his hands, he dug through the rubble to the small piece of red, all the while praying that he was wrong, and that Jason was somewhere else. His actions were halted as he finally came to what he had been looking for. His heart clenching painfully in his chest as his eyes widened in a mixture of disbelief and horror.
No.
He murmured as he carefully reached forward, cradling the limp body in his arms as he stood, tears fighting against his self-control as he stared down at the body of his son. Ash falling from the sky around him, as the fires raged dangerously around him. Jason, Surrey, England, May 10th, 1536. 1 year later, Harry sighed as he carefully patted down the soil before him, careful to not damage his aunt's flowers. She prided herself on her award-winning garden, and even now that they were leaving she demanded that it be left in prime condition. As a result, rather than doing a last-minute check on his possessions, he was organizing the flower beds and making sure that there would be no unsightly lumps of dirt for when the new owners arrive in a few days. He wasn't sure what to make of this move. He hadn't been able to really come to terms with it even now, weeks after he had been told alongside Dudley. His aunt and uncle had sat them down and explained as well as you could to two 4-year-olds that they were moving far away, to a whole other country for that matter, and that they would probably never come back and see anyone they knew ever again. Both had given Harry a funny look at that point before being distracted by Dudley, who wasn't happy that he would have to leave all his friends behind. They had all had to endure 10 minutes of screaming, whining, and finally a temper tantrum. It had only ended once Petunia and Vernon had offered to buy Dudley a lot of presents and reminded him that he'll make a lot of new friends, and ones, according to them, who were better than his current ones. That had got Harry thinking, if Dudley could make new friends, then maybe Harry could too. They had only been going to school for the past few months, over which time Harry had attempted to become friends with most of the kids in his class. At first he had been pretty successful, but then Dudley had apparently decided that Harry was more fun to bully when no one stuck up for him, and had made himself known by threatening anyone who tried to play with the younger boy. The teachers had noticed pretty quickly when Harry's bright attitude had greatly dimmed, and everyone apart from Dudley and his friends who would often sneer at him were outwardly avoiding being near him. They had tried to help Miss Charles, his current teacher, particularly. However, one meeting after with his aunt and uncle had her also avoiding Harry. He didn't understand what they had said, but she took to ignoring Harry when he put his hand up, and pretended to not see him when he ran past Dudley and his friends hot on his heels. It greatly upset him. However, he didn't know what to do. It wasn't like he could talk to his parents, and he had no friends, and his family were a big no-no. As a result, the concept of moving somewhere new where no one had judged him was very appealing to him. However, it came with the sacrifice of leaving all that he knew behind. Not that he was leaving all that much behind. He knew no one beyond his school, and most of the neighbors looked down on him despite the fact he had ever even so much as spoken a hello to them. Mrs. Figg, who lived a few houses down, seemed to like him, but she smelled like pee and had loads of cats, many of which didn't like him all that much if the scratch marks his ankle sported were any indicator. Many of them would eye him like a piece of meat, which was extremely odd and unnerving considering the fact that he had learned that cats only eat things like fish and birds, until he was at least 16, and that definitely wasn't a few years to his mind. That was a lot of years and would no doubt feel like forever. He had said as much to the elderly lady, who had laughed at his reply, saying something along the lines of "not as long as you think," before changing the subject to her cats. She was definitively quirky and odd, but she was in a good way. Harry often liked to think that she was what friends would be like, someone who could make you laugh and who you could tell anything to. At this thought, Harry frowned, his hands stilling in their movements in the soil. Mrs. Figg was the closest thing he had to a friend, really, and if he was honest, she could be the only thing that he was leaving behind. Such a thought did not sit well with the 4-year-old, but he knew he had no choice in the matter. Even if he were to protest, they would still be moving, and rather than being bribed with the promise of presents and new friends, he would probably get a clap round the ear hole and told to shut up. The thing he didn't like the most was the fact that he hadn't even been able to tell Mrs. Figg that they were moving. His aunt and uncle were being oddly quiet about the move. Heck, his aunt hadn't even told her gossip buddy Miss Freeman, who lived next door. It was as if they were trying to avoid someone finding out, which didn't seem like them at all. Even in the short amount of years that he had been conscious enough to know them, Harry had come to realize that his family liked to brag about their achievements. And if what Uncle Vernon said about his job was true, then they should be marching up and down the street in the middle of the night shouting it for all to hear. Their current behavior was therefore quite puzzling, and had left Dudley moaning about how he couldn't brag to his friends and Harry silently brooding. He could always tell Mrs. Figg in secret, but he was smart enough to know that if his aunt and uncle found out he would be in big trouble. And he hadn't been able to spend much time with her since the imminent move had been announced over a month ago. The house had been sold through a discreet estate agent, and some sneaky viewings which were passed off as old family friend visits or Uncle Vernon's business associates. Whatever an associate was, in that time Harry and a somewhat reluctant Dudley had been tasked with helping around the home, helping clean and keep the garden tidy, or even helping to repaint some of the walls. Dudley wouldn't stop whining and had to be pacified more than once. Eventually he had settled into doing the easiest of chores while Harry was tasked with the more taxing ones. It was annoying but expected, and Harry had just got on with it. Aunt Petunia had only told the school last week and had asked the head to keep it hushed up until they were gone, which was again odd behavior, and Harry couldn't help but have the nagging feeling he was missing the big picture here. They had as a result been kept busy, and what had originally seemed like a long space of time for the 4-year-old had passed by almost frighteningly fast, and had left him feeling with a hollow, sickly feeling in his stomach. What if he didn't like the new country? What if his new school was worse than his old one? Would he still have to sleep in a cupboard in the new house? Such questions had been constantly assaulting his thoughts, and had made the situation all the more daunting. He wasn't sure if he wanted to go. Uncle Vernon had said that this this better job would be a good opportunity for all of them, yes, even Harry, and that this was the start of a new beginning. He had explained that since the company was in its early stages in the new country, that it needed all the employees it could get as soon as possible, and that Vernon had volunteered to move out there under the condition that the flights were paid for by the company. They had agreed, and so the family had been rushed into preparing for the move, a new house having been also purchased through their estate agent, who had negotiated with another agent apparently in the new country. Harry really didn't get it, or what the big deal was with the crime rate, or why he had seemed to stress that point. Finally the day had rolled around, and the packing, which had started days ago, was still no closer to being complete with how Dudley was acting. Because the new house already had furniture, they could only take a certain amount of things with them, and Dudley didn't want to give up any of his toys. It had been a long argument and was still going on. Harry had actually volunteered to do a last-minute tidy of the flower beds to get out of there. His packing he'd been done in half an hour, his aunt having gone through his hand-me-downs, throwing away many of them for their ratty appearance. By the time she was finished, he only had a small amount of clothes left, that coupled with his 2 books and 1 toy army figure that had once belonged to Dudley fitted snugly into his backpack, which would be traveling with him. That had of course left an empty case for his relatives to use for the mountains of toys. However, even that couldn't fit them all in. "I want it." Harry cringed slightly as his ears caught the loud high-pitched whining from the upstairs window. Dudley could give screeching cats a run for their money. He glanced up, his eyes catching the bottom the window, which had been partially opened to allow air in. The sun, still high in the sky, glinted off the glass. Of course, now that they were actually leaving, they had told the neighbors that they were going on holiday for a few weeks, his aunt falsely bragging about some place called Spain. "Dudders, you can't fit anything else in the case. And me and Daddy don't have any room for it." His aunt's voice, a lot softer, indicating that she was trying to placate the other, floated down as Harry did a last-minute scan over his work before carefully standing up to brush dirt off the front of his too large trousers. He was sweating lightly through his blue and white flannel shirt, the sun feeling almost unbearable at the moment. He glanced up once more as another screech and hurried shushing sound occurred before a thin, pale wrist darted out to tug the window shut. Despite the heat, he really didn't want to go back in, at least not until Dudley had settled down. His older, and much larger, cousin had a bad tendency to punch Harry's arm when he wasn't getting what he wanted. That, coupled with the fact that his aunt was arguing with her precious Dudders, probably didn't bode well for him if he didn't want to get shouted at. Therefore the garden was a safe, neutral zone at the moment. However, they would be leaving for the airport in half an hour's time, and with the garden in immaculate condition, he had no other option unless he wanted to be caught lingering. If that happened, he'd get accused of being lazy and probably given double chores, with was always fun. Note the sarcasm. Sighing once again, he walked at a sedate pace around the side of the house to the slightly ajar front door. The car had been reversed into the drive and the boot was hanging wide open. 2 of the cases were already in. Of course his aunts and uncles Dudley's were still in process of fitting all the junk he could into them. Peeking round the door's edge he found the hall clear, the slight muffled voices indicating that his aunt and Dudley were still upstairs. Vernon was most likely doing a last-minute check of their room. Relieved, he carefully entered, purposefully keeping his steps light even on the carpeted floor. The sun was shining through the windows, lighting the house and making it a nice warm temperature that would be perfect for lounging. However, there would be no time for that today, so he quickly made his way over to his cupboard. Opening the thin wooden door revealed that it was almost bare now, his thin mattress and bedding having been thrown away with his older clothes. There was a single shelf screwed into one of the walls where he had placed his books as well as his army figure. That too was now bare, everything carefully contained within the rucksack that sat in the middle of the floor. He paused, looking round with an almost fond look at his room. He could remember times playing in here and reading under the single hanging light bulb. However, with such thoughts came the other memories of punishments, of being locked in for a few hours for misbehaving or being denied meals. Frowning, he gave the cupboard one last glance before reaching in to snag the backpack and quickly left, pulling on the hanging cord, as he did so bathing it in darkness. He shut the door firmly behind him and turned to head back outside to place his bag in the car. He had almost made it when the heavy bark of his uncle caught his attention. "Boy, get up here." The voice was slightly muffled, but thanks to the natural high bark, he could hear it clearly enough. Almost groaning in irritation, he dropped the bag next to the door before turning to head up the staircase. Once he had reached the top, he quickly headed to where he could hear the loud breathing of his uncle. It was coming from Dudley's second bedroom, along with the muffled and extremely fake-sounding sobs of his elder cousin. Walking over at a normal pace, knowing that dallying would only get him moaned at, well, more than usual, he made his way to the doorframe and looked into the room. Petunia was knelt before Dudley, who had his eyes tightly shut, his fists balled up next to his pudgy face, as his mouth opened and shut while emitting sobs. His blonde greasy hair was slicked slightly with sweat, however, unlike Harry's messy mop, it lay flat and neat, the slight lines suggesting that his aunt had brushed it. He was dressed in a pair of shorts, a red t-shirt with some odd football logo over where his heart was, a pair of brand new sneakers on his feet. Petunia had her hands on his shoulder and was looking almost desperate as she tried to calm him down, casting apprehensive eyes at some of the toys that remained on the floor around then, and nearly full bin bag sat a few feet away next to a zipped black case. Her blue summer dress, which was not often seen in England due to the normally dreary weather, was clinging to her and didn't help her to look any less odd with her long horse-like neck. Her hair, which had been long a month ago, was now short and in a styled bob, cut, a few of the longer bangs hanging in her face, the brown contrasting against the blue eyes she shared with her son. Behind the two, Vernon was standing next to another black case. His normally pale face had red creeping into the cheeks, his breathing loud and heavy. Harry couldn't help but stare at him as if he was insane. The man had dressed himself in a maroon jumper over what looked like a white shirt, a pair of crisp black slacks and leather shoes, over which he was wearing his normal gray rain-proofed coat. His own head of blonde, neatly combed hair was also slicked with sweat, but even more so, his bushy mustache was practically sticking to his face. His brown eyes were squinting as he stared down at the case with a look that suggested he wanted it to burst spontaneously into flames. It would have been amusing on anyone else. Well, it was still funny, but Harry knew better than to laugh. "Yes, Uncle Vernon?" Harry questioned quietly, hoping the man wouldn't hear him over his own breathing. Unfortunately, his uncle had sharper hearing than he gave him credit for and span around to glare at Harry. Harry in turn felt himself shrink slightly as he caught the look, and brought his green eyes down slightly, not wanting to keep the gaze. "Boy, finish cleaning up these blasted toys," he replied before reaching down to grasp the case in his chubby hands and drag it towards the doorway. He grunted and was hissing something under his breath that resulted in Petunia shooting him a slightly dirty look before she returned her attention to Dudley. Harry patiently waited until he had made it out of the room before squeezing past and into the room. He cautiously made his way around the room, picking up the discarded toys as he went and depositing them in the open bin bag. As he did so, Dudley's sobs got louder and Petunia was getting more and more desperate. Finally, after what felt like forever, Dudley quieted Petunia's voice drifting by Harry as he ignored them both. "It's all right, Dudders, we'll get you all new toys. Better ones." An envious feeling welled up in Harry before he quickly stomped it down. It would do him no good to get jealous of Dudley. He finished his task as his uncle stomped back into the room, his face now a deep shade of red. A fierce glare directed to the remaining case as Harry tied the bin bag shut. "Boy, take that out back, then get in the car," Vernon ordered before reluctantly moving over to the final case. Harry now struggling to pull the heavy, as in very extremely heavy bag behind him. He had just made it down the first of the stairs when he realized he had miscalculated the probability of his 4-year-old body being able to successfully carry a bag of heavy toys down a staircase. "Oh no," was the only thought he could manage before said back started to tumble, Harry making a useless attempt to stop it only to nearly fall down the stairs himself as he stumbled back from the weight. He grasped desperately at the banister and just caught himself before the bag knocked him once more and made him lose his grip. Thankfully he was only 2 steps from the bottom at this point and landed on the floor with a pained yelp, his butt and lower back loudly protesting. There was a small bang, then a ripping sound, and Harry was looking at a now open bin bag that had spilled most of its contents onto the floor, the broken toys and video games scattering from the black plastic. It was going to be a long day. Boy, long day.
Strishka.
Thankfully, after Harry's accident, something his uncle was still glaring at him for, and a quick clean-up with a new bin bag, the family had finished packing the car and headed off to the airport, saying their own goodbyes to little whinging, knowing that it could very well be the last time they saw the place. Harry had stared forlornly out of the window for most of the drive, trying to ignore the ever-present annoyance that was Dudley, who had been immensely cheered by Harry's fall, and the following scolding that left the younger boy staring down at his feet, his hands massaging the bruised bottom he had received from the fall. The elder boy had taken to punching Harry's arm every time his parents looked away. He had done it to the point where the limb had picked up a numb feeling, leaving Harry sorely tempted to hit back. However, he knew that even if the very slight muscle he had in his arms made an impact, he would only be scolded further by his aunt and uncle, despite the fact that Dudley had hit him first. Finally, after what felt like forever, they were pulling into a busy car park, his uncle wandering off to find a trolley for the cases as his aunt rifled through some paperwork she had in her purse. Before they could get on the plane, they needed to hand the car over to some company called Rental. Then they would have to check in and wait for a few hours before they would be getting on the plane. Harry was slightly nervous. He had never flown before and was apprehensive of anything going wrong, despite how much Petunia was assuring Dudley it would be fine. After Vernon returned, they had loaded up the cart and headed straight there. There was quick exchange of keys and paperwork, and then they were checking in. Going through the metal detector had been fun, as had the security pulling Uncle Vernon over to scan him over, then pat him down to make sure that he had no concealed weapons. When he demanded to know why they had chosen him out of all the people going past, they had simply replied he looked like the type. He had been fuming after that and had stormed off extremely insulted. Nothing much had happened after, apart from a few hours spent wandering around or sitting in a cafe waiting for their flight. When it had finally come time to board, Harry had been a mix of nervous energy and barely concealed excitement as he looked through the balding hall's window at the massive plane that would be taking them to their new home. The plane, as expected, had been massive, and Uncle Vernon had been less than pleased to discover they had been sat in the middle row to accompany all 4 of them. Harry had instantly been sat on the end with a whining Dudley next to him, but he hadn't minded as he discovered that all the seats had their own TVs, which he had used to ignore his overly large cousin during the flight. Well, apart from when he punched him in the arm, but he had stopped as he noticed a lady in the next row was glaring daggers at him. After what had to be hours of watching movies and TV programs he had never heard of, and gaining a very sore and numb bottom from the constant sitting, they had landed only to chauffeured onto another plane. Much smaller this time, much to Harry's disappointment, and without TVs, though thankfully it was a much shorter flight. By this point Harry had become extremely tired, having not been able to sleep very well in the seat, and was at this point drifting between consciousness when the captain's voice came over the speaker. Hello ladies and gentlemen. We've been informed that there is a situation happening at Gotham's airport. As a result, I'm afraid we've been redirected to the closest airport situated in Bloodhaven. Transportation will be provided free of charge for this delay. Thank you for flying with us, and please have a nice day. The speaker went dead, and Vernon instantly lit up, complaining about how they were supposed to be getting picked up by someone working for his company, and other various things like the quality of the food and such. Harry couldn't really be sure, as he had zoned out at this point, back to his half-awake, half-dream-like days. When they landed, he had followed slowly, his backpack slung uselessly on his back as he stumbled every few seconds. Thankfully Dudley was in a similar state, meaning that the older boy wasn't annoying Harry and was for once quiet. They all were, and Vernon appeared to be the only one left with the energy, even if only slight, to be loud. They had just made it past security and Vernon was on his fifth rant about missing the chance for a free ride when they spotted a thin, weedy man in the crowd of waiting people holding a sign with Dudley written on it. They instantly made a beeline for him, the man looking up slightly in surprise as they stopped before him and then exchanging the look for a smile. You must be Vernon. I'm Stephen Blooms, I'll be working with you at Grunnings," he explained as he shook Vernon's hand. Turning slightly to do the same to Petunia as he continued to speak, "I heard about the incident at Gotham Airport and figured they would relay the flight to here." He went on and on as he helped the family with their cases to a large black car, loading them into a wide boot as he chatted quietly with Vernon about the company and how it was coming along. Harry had somehow scored a window seat in the back as Dudley had demanded that he could lay his head on Petunia's shoulder, meaning Harry could rest against the closed door and stare at the window aimlessly as his eyes slowly started to drift shut. He caught sight of a few features of the dark city they were passing through, however he paid them little attention. Instead he focused on the other striking features that surrounded them. The darkened sky, for example, that at points appeared to have a red tint to it. The odd shady-looking people who were standing on street corners scantily dressed. Petunia had squeaked upon spotting them, her hand instantly covering Dudley's eyes until they had passed. Harry had been curious about the looks that his aunt and uncle had slowly started to sport as they moved through the tall arching buildings and busy slow-moving roads. They looked worried, extremely worried, and Vernon had posed the question of what Gotham was like to Stephen. The other had frozen, his hands tightening on the wheel for a moment before he carefully glanced at Vernon from the corner of his eye, the other maintaining its gaze on the road as he exchanged lanes and came to a large skeleton-like bridge that connected to what looked like an even darker, if possible, and larger version of the city they were passing through. "What did they tell you?" he had asked, softly, voice careful and controlled. Vernon and Petunia, picking up on some hidden meaning within the question, narrowed their eyes. "Not much, only that it was the ideal place for the company to expand and that due to the location the pay would be substantial," he replied, that worried look getting worse as they came closer to the Gothic-like city, which was currently lit up with bright flowing lights. However, instead of making it warm and welcoming, it made it appear all the more threatening. By this point Harry was barely hanging on by a thread, and even the appearance of the scary-looking city didn't give him a big enough burst of adrenaline to keep him conscious. Even the loud protesting of his aunt and uncle and the soft, short, crisp responses of Stephen did not help matters in the least. As his eyes slid shut, the overwhelming exhaustion sweeping through his 4-year-old body, his eyes caught onto an approaching sign, lit up by a series of light hanging over the top of it. His limited knowledge of the alphabet didn't deter him from reading it, and his eyes had momentarily focused upon it before sleep overpowered him, the words echoing in his dreams. "Welcome to Gotham City." 4 years later, when they had initially moved to Gotham City, it had taken a lot of willpower and some odd form of determination on the parts of his aunt and uncle to remain within what had been revealed to be a crime-infested city. Vernon's old boss in England had conveniently forgotten to mention that part. After the truth of the city and its inhabitants, which included a variety of costumed psychopaths, a bat-dressed vigilante, as well as all the rest, the two had wanted nothing more than to jump onto the next flight back to Britain. Things had been made worse when it was revealed that their flight's delay had been down to one of said psychopaths attacking the airport and taking the mayor hostage. That, coupled with the creepy atmosphere of Gotham at nighttime, had not made an overall great first impression upon the couple. However, upon learning exactly what he would be earning, as well as the confirmation that the house they had purchased through the dodgy and strangely always unavailable estate agent was in one of the less crime-ridden areas they had stayed. Though once again Harry had been under the impression that there was something else to it than just simply money, and the chance that their house would be ignored in favor of the highly populated city center with its penthouse suites, or even the few mansions that were dotted around the slight countryside that lay on the city limits. The Narrows themselves were set off of the main city on an isle of their own which catered to the working class. However, there was a separate community on the south of the isle that dealt with families that were just above the poverty line. This area was known as Honeyales, heaven knows why. It was a small community and had only around 25 homes, all of which were set in various cul-de-sacs. When Stephen had dropped them off that first night, they hadn't really been able to see, due to the light and the fatigue that was overpowering all of them. But even so, in such a tired and worn-out state with poor lighting, they had become sure of one thing. Well, in fact, it was more Vernon and Petunia than Dudley or Harry. It hadn't been worth it. The house was in great disrepair, the drains barely hanging on, with a small garden overrun by weeds. What appeared to be a shaggy black dog was napping in the front yard. A small mound of dirt sat near it, belaying that it had been digging earlier in the day. The sun was at this point in the middle of the sky, barely peeking through grayish clouds, and making the brick of the home look a dark murky brown rather than the standard red of Britain. The slanted roof needed new slates, and the windows were fogged with dirt and mist. All in all, not an impressive first impression. What made it worse was perhaps the fact that the entire neighborhood looked to be in the same condition. The standard cul-de-sac was layered with litter and the various bowl movements of the local pets. The "Beware of Burglars" sign that was bolted to the nearby lamppost didn't really inspire much confidence either, and all in all, the Dursleys were seriously considering telling Vernon's new boss to shove the job and the house where the sun doesn't shine. However, Vernon, being the stubborn imitation of a small killer whale that he was, instructed them to enter, claiming that he would contact the estate agent and demand an explanation when he was not entirely jet-lagged. The family had therefore reluctantly shuffled their way up the old concrete path to the murky green front door, Petunia going as far as to actually place Dudley behind her as she awkwardly sidestepped along the path when they passed the snoozing Pooch, whose ear twitched slightly in response. The inside proved to be as big a disappointment as the out. The wallpaper was old and extremely dirted, some pieces actually coming off the walls slightly like bubbles in a milkshake. The wooden floors were sticky and make small creaking noises whenever a step was taken, stained a dark brown that Petunia prayed was a result of mud and not some other substance. A heavily musk hung in the air, and Harry was faintly reminded of old Miss Figg and her home, which had carried a similar stench with an odd tinge of pea, making it only slightly more pungent than this. As such, in Harry's opinion, the home was bearable. One plus was that furniture was being provided with the house, which meant that the family had somewhere to sit as well as sleep. Dudley didn't waste time, as he demanded to have the biggest room that came with a standard queen-sized bed. His aunt and uncle had simply rolled with it and had gone for the next largest, but not before instructing Harry to go for the smallest that sat on the other side of the house. They had done this after discovering that this house lacked even a cupboard under the stairwell, and had reluctantly agreed that the cupboard that held the heater was too small to fit him in, as well as Petunia's towels. As such, Harry, for the first time that he could remember in his very young life, had a room. It was nothing special and stood in the same disrepair as the rest of the home, but to the child who had never had anything to truly call his own, it was heaven on earth. He had entered without argument, dropping the small rucksack that held all his possessions on the carpet as he stared around his room in amazement. It was painted a creamy green, small flecks where the paint had been knocked off revealing that the walls were originally a midnight blue. There was a standard single bed with a metal frame that wobbled even under his small weight, sat against the wall across from an old wooden wardrobe that looked like it had been taken straight out of a T.S. Lewis novel. A matching desk sat under a wide window just to the left of the bed. It contrasted greatly with the dark grayish carpet that felt like velvet under Harry's tired feet. Everything was covered in a thin film of dust that drifted slightly when a breeze caught it, the dust making small spirals as it became airborne. The window itself was wide open and lacked drapes. Harry hadn't minded as he had moved closer, finding his view mostly blocked by a large oak tree that wound up from the backyard, one of its thick branches hanging close enough that he could climb onto it if he tried. Twisting slightly, he looked up at the gray sky, a yawn breaking from his mouth as he stared tiredly at the drifting clouds. He stayed like this for a minute. His drooping eyelids, however, demanded his attention, and reluctantly, he turned away to climb into his bed, pulling the small sheet that lay at the bottom over himself, not minding the lack of a duvet in this unusually hot climate. He had slept peacefully that night and well into the next day, his slumber only being disturbed by the annoying screeching of his aunt as she demanded he help her cook for Duddykins. Harry had done as asked and had reluctantly peeled himself away from his mattress. During the cooking session, Harry learned that Vernon had already attempted to call the estate agent, only for there to be no answer, as would become a routine in the following few days, until finally Vernon conceded and made the promise to Petunia that he would fix up the house, or at the least look for a new home when they could afford to move. As a result, their first week in Gotham City was spent mostly out of the house, Vernon being granted 2 weeks off to settle before he would start work, and in stores as professionals were called in to make the house fit for Dursley standards. Petunia had spent her time picking colors as well as matching furniture and buying the essentials, More cleaning supplies than would ever be needed, as well as every piece of cutlery and useless kitchen equipment you could think of, and even those you can't think of, for the house. She also made a point of fixing the garden, planting extravagant flowers after Harry had weeded the beds. She didn't seem to recognize the fact that most of these flowers would die as the climate was incorrect for them. Even so, it came off as an impressive sight with the colorful buds peeking through the freshly painted white picket fence. However, many of these flowers were killed by another source, namely Shaggy. The dog that had been there when they arrived had made a point of refusing to move. It was apparently the neighborhood stray and had been named by the local children as the Shaggy dog. The adults apparently had a different reason for calling it that, but for the life of him Harry couldn't figure out why. Shaggy apparently liked their yard and refused to leave sleeping the day away. Only when Vernon called animal control did the dog disappear, later returning after the men had failed to locate him. This led to Vernon once again calling for the pound. However, Shaggy simply disappeared once again. This turned into a pattern over the next few weeks until the pound simply gave up, unhappy with Vernon's constant complaints and insults. He was unknowingly blacklisted by them in response and was refused by all pounds within the city who had learned of the walrus's knack for insulting. As a result, Shaggy stayed, often accompanying Harry during his many hours of chores that involved the garden, or sleeping until he sensed Petunia Eves dropping over the back fence, upon which point he would bark and scare the hell out of her. Harry was positive that the dog was laughing when he did that. The house also improved with new paint and furnishings. It now looked like a standard and safe place to live. It was now painted in a warm burgundy with matching furnishings, and the wooden floor, having been replaced, was now a cherry rose wood that contrasted nicely with the cream carpets placed in the hall and on the staircase. The rooms, 4 in total, had been wallpapered and done in baby blue with the exception of Harry's, which had been left in its original state. Not that the boy minded liking the idea of being unique. The house now looked like a standard family home and was livable by Dursley standards, the musky smell eventually being filtered out as the roof and drains were fixed by professionals, at Petunia's insistence. Even so, the Dursleys still felt out of place in their new home. This was down to the fact that the family that prided themselves on being perfectly normal were incredibly odd by Gotham standards. Not many of the neighbors liked them, many believing the family to be too stuck-up and snobbish for their liking. The fact that their son was an outright bully, and that the parents prided upon such a fact, didn't help in the least bit. As well as this, some were suspicious as to the treatment of their nephew, as well as the meek frame and obvious hand-me-downs the boy boasted whenever he made an appearance. After settling to a minor degree, Harry and Dudley were enrolled into the local primary school, Lincoln Park. It was a nice school that was set in the southern area of the city, and was the closest school around that didn't have ridiculous tuition fees. However, due to its position as well as its public nature, many children from the Narrows flocked to it. This had made both Petunia and Vernon wary of it. However, with them being a one-car family, as well as the time period in which Vernon had to drop them off, they didn't have much choice. Dudley, who was unfortunately in the same class as Harry, made it his mission to torture his cousin at every instance, and had made a point of bullying anyone who took an interest in Harry. As such, the young boy was left friendless and mostly alone once more. The youngest, Dursley, meanwhile flourished as he formed a small gang of fellow but much smaller bullies, no one daring enough to stand up to them. As a result, he spent many of his break times avoiding Dudley, while that was when he could get out of class first. He did this through the use of the school roofs. He had found that he could use an old drain pipe at the back of the school to climb up during his first year of school. Ever since it had become a haven of sorts for him, the high vantage point allowing him to stay out of view and keep track of Dudley over the large playground, as well as avoid the ever-watchful eye of the teacher who was on recess. Harry loved it up here. The school was average size and had a fair-sized amount of grounds, and when caught in the right light provided an exceptional view. It was big enough to include a large concrete play area, as well as a small field with a pair of old white goal posts, the faded, barely visible paint defining exactly where the pitch was. Along the edge of said field was a group of trees that made up what the kids liked to call the forest. Despite it being only a small grouping, naturally the kids were banned from this area and forced to remain in sight. Running the length of the back of the school and breaking it off from the rest of the city was a large metal spiked fence. This was said to be there to keep out weirdos, or as the teacher liked to call them, boogeymen. Harry thought of it more as a prison designed to keep them in. This made it so that the only way to get out was through the large front doors and to a main road that was carefully watched by the secretary, Miss Birch, an old lady with a serious attitude problem. She constantly sneered at the kids and used language that would make a sailor blush. Well, that was when other teachers weren't around, who had the eyes of a hawk and the deviousness of a weasel. Just on the outskirts of the fence stood the tall skyscrapers that occupied Gotham. Most of the buildings were old but graceful, looking with odd jutting angles and long glass windows. When the sun managed to break through the cloudy sky, it would create large lines of light that made the buildings look as though they were crystal, almost as though they had been taken from a fairy tale. It was times like these that had Harry dreaming the day away, imagining himself running across the rooftops and gliding across the night, jumping criminals when they least expected it, pushing the innocent out of the way. Standing on the edge of a roof, a cape blowing dramatically in the wind as the bat signal shone overhead. Looking to his left, he would find a shadow standing waiting while silently encouraging the boy to continue. This was Harry's favorite daydream and occupied his mind like a cancer. However, like all dreams, it always ended with the sound of reality crashing home. This often came in the form of the school bell or rain when the clouds decided the sun had shone enough over Gotham. Harry's view on Gotham would shift at this point as he saw the danger it truly presented. As such, the young boy was prone to having mixed feelings about the city he now called home. It to some degree excited him, and he would often feel exhilarated when he journeyed into the city with his aunt for the weekly shopping. It was like entering a whole new world full of people who never stopped moving, not even to eat. However, despite his age, he was not blind. He recognized the underlying feelings of fear that hung over the city like a constant rain cloud. It was present in everything from how events occurred to the people themselves. This made Harry weary of just how far he made sure to always keep his aunt in sight. He had once lost her to the overbearing crowds, and it had taken him nearly half an hour to find her once more, by which point the at the time 5-year-old was nearly terrified of being trampled to death. However, as he grew, not much mind you, his confidence slowly but surely started to peek its head, and his naturally curious nature would lead him to exploring a little bit further and a bit more away from his aunt each time. It was at these times where he had begun to love the place in his own way, loving the feeling of independence mixed with a tinge of fear that would erupt in his chest every time he lost view of his aunt. Meanwhile, Dudley appeared to remain immune to everything but bullying and eating. Dudley, while big and strong, didn't have the energy to prosper in athletics nor the attention span to have a beyond-average IQ of a chimp. No, that was wrong. Harry had heard in science that chimps were smart, so maybe he had the IQ of something stupider like a snail. His time was often occupied by his friends or one of his many video game consoles, and as such any homework or even basic schoolwork was neglected or forced on Harry when Elder could pin him down at home. Harry, on the other hand, flourished in both academics as well as physical education. His lithe body lightly muscled from running from Dudley and his gang. His small frame made him light and a hard target in sports like dodgeball and helped him become one of the fastest in his year. The fact that the gym teacher, Mr. Parks, was in charge of recess made Harry's life for the most part bearable, and had the senses of a bloodhound, often zeroing on Dudley and his fellow troublemakers within a few minutes. As such, his older cousin hated the teacher with a passion. Mr. Parks was young and fairly new to teaching and was very enthusiastic about teaching gym. He, like all teachers, had his favorite student and those he couldn't stand the sight of. It delighted Harry to no end that Dudley was one of the latter. He had also taken an apparent liking to Harry despite his small stature. Apparently being good at his class was a great way to get on his good side. Another plus was his academic grades. Due to his aunt and uncle pretty much banning him from watching TV while they were home, he spent most of his time at home either doing chores or reading his school books. His mind absorbed the information like a sponge, and soon enough he could recall the information without hassle. He had read something once about something called a photographic memory. While he didn't instantly recall the information, or in fact all of said information, he could recall a lot more than someone his age should be able to. As such, he believed he had a variant of the skill. It had helped him rise to near the top of his class. And he was only near the top because he restricted himself. This restriction came as a result of Dudley and his family. Dudley was greatly failing in school. Said failure was put down to the poor teaching of public school in the Dursley household. How could it possibly be Duddykins' fault? And Harry was not foolish enough to think that his aunt and uncle would be pleased with his obvious accomplishment within said establishment. If anything, it would most likely only make his home life worse than it already was and create an even larger resentment for him. As well as this, he didn't need to give Dudley more reasons to bully him, As such, he would answer questions purposely wrong or even act oblivious when in class to keep up appearances. It led to more than a few cocked eyebrows from teachers who could tell from his homework that he knew the subject matter. On more than one occasion they had stopped him after class to ask if someone else was doing his homework for him, which had led to them giving them a baffled look. Who on earth would do homework for him? Harry's school life was therefore very complicated for a boy of 7, and often left the young child confused beyond belief. However, his grades weren't only down to his restriction but also the boy's own nature. Harry was a daydreamer and spent much of his time in and outside of class imagining a different life. A life where he lived with his parents or one where another relative showed up wanting to take him with them on an adventure. A life where he ran across the rooftops as a hero that the world looked to for protection. A life where he mattered, but that would never happen. It wasn't that he wasn't interested in school or anything. He was smart enough to understand most of what was being taught within a few lessons, and unlike others, he could, thanks to his memory, recall most of it. It was just, he was 7, and like all kids he quickly grew bored with routine and class in general. School, while interesting, was often boring, and like all children he desired nothing more than to escape the building that felt like a prison. Other than school and his poor home life, Harry spent what time he could, as in when he could get away, wandering the cul-de-sac or walking the by now well-known path that led from home to school, a path which cut through the area most referred to as the Narrows. This had started out when he attempted to avoid Dudley and the gang of idiots he called friends and had chosen to walk home. He knew the general direction, having driven through the Narrows a few times when the family was running late. Vernon did his best to avoid said area, and on the rare occasion they did drive through the very rundown area, he would constantly critique it and the people who lived there. Harry swore that someday his uncle's mouth was going to get him into serious trouble, that and his attitude to everything he believed to be below him. The Narrows was a large area that consisted of many rundown flats and derelict buildings lined around the coast with old construction sites. It housed the majority of Gotham's working class as well as a large amount of homeless people. It was set on an island just off the mainland of Gotham City itself. There was a long bridge that connected the two and served as a barrier, though truthfully the area set at the other end of the bridge was barely in a better condition. The Narrows was overall depressing and looked to be older than any other part of Gotham, with its small narrow alleyways and poorly lit roads. It had a dangerous vibe constantly hanging around it, and the low lighting as well as general filth around the area didn't help the appearance in the least bit. Nor did the West Side, which had been apparently dedicated to clubs for adults and bars that never closed. It was the most alive and dangerous part of the place, and Harry had, luckily and surprisingly sadly, only seen it once in passing when Vernon had made a wrong turning. The area was swarming with people, most of which were tripping over their own feet, while women were dressed in next to nothing, and would lean at what had to be uncomfortable angles upon lampposts as men would pass, music blasting in the background with neon lights flickering and making the street a strange array of colors. Harry had never ventured back, had never in fact ventured off the path that he knew at this point by heart, never being able to push himself as he did when he was with his aunt shopping. For while the crowds of Gotham were overbearing and suffocating in most situations, he still felt safer among them than these dark alleyways where you could see barely 3 feet in front of your face. This wasn't helped in the least bit by the people who lived there. It was an unsaid rule that you stick to yourself in the Narrows. The only one who mattered was you. The idea of companionship was lost on many who valued independency as well as money above all else. Everyone who lived there carried a certain look. The sag of cheeks, an empty hollow eye, and overly baggy or ripped clothing, or in fact next to none. The saddest art was that the gangs who occupied the area were usually the most well-dressed. They would walk with their heads down almost as if making eye contact was illegal, and leave as much room between you and them as they could. They were also beyond paranoid and would check over their shoulder every few minutes as if they expected someone to come right up to them and stab them in the back. Harry fit right in here. His small, somewhat malnourished frame allowed him to weave out of the way of many, and his overly large hand-me-downs as well as general dirty look allowed him to blend in all too easily. Not that anyone cared. Again, as long as you left them alone, it was likely that no one would bother you. Well, with the exception of gangs or the occasional psycho who ran through there from time to time, these gangs mostly consisted of small-time pickpockets who rallied together believing they could become the big league gangsters. Ha! As if they did somehow make it to the top, they would be knocked right back down again by Batman, and it would serve them right. If there was one thing Harry hated, it was bullies, and that idea didn't stick to only Dudley and his friends. rather it extended to any of those who hurt others for fun. Harry had been a victim for as long as he could remember, and no one had helped him. He had been alone in the world, constantly running away in fear of what would happen when the world, or rather in this case Dudley, caught up to him. And sadly enough he had resigned himself to this, believing that running was the best way to deal with the obvious problem. No one would help him with the exception of Mr. Parks when he was on duty. But he couldn't be around to always protect him, and no other adult paid any positive attention to him. He was alone in the world, and that was how he would remain. Well, at least that was what he thought. It all changed quite startlingly on a Monday evening in November. Gotham City, November 3rd, 8:49 Eastern Daylight Time. 4 years later, Harry sighed slightly to himself as he watched the road and busy streets outside, his boredom all too apparent even as his uncle and cousin ignored his presence within the moving vehicle. They had been arguing for the past 10 minutes, a surprising occurrence in this family, and had now raised their voices to the pitch that Harry was almost embarrassed to look over and see the driver from the lane next to theirs looking over in confusion. He had his eyebrows raised and was giving them all a critical look. Harry blushed slightly when the man's eyes landed on him, quickly breaking the brief eye lock and bringing his attention back to his own vehicle. "But I don't wanna Joe." Dudley's voice went right through Harry. His unfortunately youthful voice, having not broken yet, came off as a girly shriek and made Harry actually cringe slightly. He was actually making bailing babies look more well-behaved. He silently thanked God that Aunt Petunia had not accompanied them today. Her voice could shatter glass, and that was before arguments. Another plus of his absent aunt was that Dudley got front seat rights, which meant Vernon had almost forgotten Harry was here, not having to glance in the back to argue. As such, his uncle had yet to turn his nasty temper on him. For that Harry was even more grateful. His uncle was scary enough at the best of times with his extreme weight and blubbery frame. Yes, he had added even more pounds since moving to America, mostly due to the takeaway having insane portions. He was made all the more intimidating by the strange fact that the color of his face changed to suit his moods. Harry had secretly found it amusing and had dubbed it his uncle's superpower. And his hero name was the amazing indigo-faced man, also sometimes known as red as a tomato-faced man. Take your pick, they all indicated the same unusual habit that plagued the walrus of a man. Walrus? Walrus. Uncle? Nowhere. How about walrus? Man. Yeah, that's it.
Walrusmann.
As Harry was thinking this to himself, his attention had once more drifted away, and he didn't notice the raise in tempo of the argument nor the fact that Dudley had fake tears streaming down his face. Harry had only grown slightly over the years. He was still short. He was the shortest in his year, in fact, and thin. However, in addition was the minor muscles that traced his frame. His emerald eyes had a constant spark of curiosity with them and would glow in even the dullest of lights, and emphasized his round face perfectly. His hair was actually shorter now, Petunia having become sick of his messy locks. She had reluctantly paid for him to have it cut every month, and now Harry sported the regular short hair of any boy his age. This of course came with the downside, in the Dursleys' opinions, of showing off his lightning bolt scar. Harry as such loved it all the more and enjoyed how unique he appeared in comparison to others. However, his large hand-me-downs had yet to change in the slightest. The clothes he had arrived in 4 years ago had just started to fit him, and as such Petunia had chosen to keep the rest of her money, and restrict what she spent on Harry to his monthly haircut and the occasional school supply. Dudley meanwhile had yet to change. He was still fat and blonde and did a wonderful impression of a beached whale when he couldn't get up from the couch. A large faked sob was drawn on through the nose and came off sounding like a pig grunting loudly, snapping Harry out of his amused thoughts. Harry simply rolled his own, staring at the sight in disbelief. And here we go, he thought to himself as he watched Dudley open his large mouth. It was like watching a train wreck to Harry, who already knew what the conclusion would be as soon as his cousin began. "Please, Daddy." Please, as he spoke, his voice had thankfully lowered in volume. However, now it was supposed to be weak and feeble as Dudley, full on puppy dog, pouted his father. How exactly Harry's aunt and uncle found this at all adorable Harry didn't get. Wasn't the puppy dog pout supposed to make you look like a cute dog? If Dudley was a dog, it certainly wasn't cute or something any wise person would approach without a large stick ready to beat it back. What do you know, he kind of looks like a bulldog. Not exactly Harry definition of cute, but at least this time it looked like something of the dog family, unlike the last one. Last time it looked like he had eaten the dog and had a severe case of gas, actually looking like that wasn't too far off from how he looked in general. Vernon tried to hold a straight face, his chubby face minutely trembling as he somehow struggled against his odd-looking son, until finally he looked away and sighed slightly, his anger draining out of him. The purple color of his face also slowly receded as he turned his attention back to Dudley, who was still holding the pout, his own chubby face pooling slightly upon itself. "Okay, Dudders, I'll take you home," this was said in a voice that clearly showed that Vernon had surrendered once again to his son. "Besides, you don't need to take a bloody intelligence test here." He paused and gave Dudley a slight smile. "We already know you're smarter than all the kids in this school. Beside that, school's always been against you, stupid kids and teachers." And there it was, Vernon ignoring Dudley's obvious failure in favor of blaming a public school. Harry sighed slightly to himself, shaking his head as he watched the scene. Unbelievable. Dudley as usual got what he wanted, and Harry knew that if he had tried the same tactic, he would have been given double chores. "Boy!" Harry snapped to attention, his back tightening slightly. His uncle had turned to face him, slightly a sneer playing on his lips. His eyes had narrowed, and any affection that he had shown only moments ago was now long gone. "Yes, Uncle Vernon?" Harry questioned, keeping his voice low as he did so. He didn't want to test his uncle after how angry he had been before. "Get out now, I'm taking Dudley home. You can walk the rest of the way, and then walk home when it's finished," Vernon told the boy, Dudley smirking in response before smugly pulling his tongue at Harry. "Boo!" Harry's return argument was interrupted by the loud sound of a horn, the car behind informing them that the light had finally changed. "Out!" shouted Vernon. Harry balked slightly before grabbing his rucksack and shuffling along the back seat to the other side of the car. He opened the door as quickly as possible, then jumped out onto the busy streets. He shut it just as quickly and watched as Vernon didn't cast a second glance at him as he took off, leaving the 8-year-old to make his way through the crowds to school. "Typical. Just because Dudley can't be bothered to go to school, I have to walk," Harry thought to himself as he watched the car drive off. He growled slightly to himself in irritation before shouldering his rucksack and kicking the floor slightly with a huff. As he did this, he was knocked forward as one of the many pedestrians knocked into him. He barely caught himself and avoided a face full of cement as he was knocked by yet another in the crowd. Vernon had dropped him on the outskirts of the Narrows, which was made up of a series of shops and restaurants. It was also had a range of small companies working in this area. As a result, it was a hectic place where you had to have your wits about you to avoid being lost in a mass of people. Unfortunately for Harry, who was very aware of his surroundings, he was also very small. This meant less people would spot him and that he would be knocked around like a pinball, that or squashed like a bug under the crowd's feet. Ugh! Harry was forced into the center of the crowd as a woman smacked into him. He quickly swerved on his ankle, barely avoiding an elderly man who appeared to be struggling to make his way through. He didn't have time to breathe as he felt the people behind him begin to push, forcing him to make his way through the crowd. He was bumped back and forth and had to squeeze himself between a couple who had chosen to stand in the middle of the path and start having a conversation for God knows what reason. Harry gasped as he was knocked into a stall, whacking his shoulder on the wooden table, making it shake in reaction, knocking a stack of the newspapers to the ground. You stupid little idiot, look what you did." Harry froze, his eyes widening as he stared up at the man in fear. His hand tightened over the single strap of his bag as he tried to back away, only to be caught by the crowd once more. He was pushed again and forced to walk sideways for a moment before spinning on his heel and taking off into the crowd. "Come back here, you little," whatever else was shouted was lost to the noise of the mass of people, and Harry was overwhelmingly relieved when he made it to the zebra crossing that led to his school. He rushed across it and out onto the opposite street, which was thankfully a lot less busy than the street he had just been on. He slowed momentarily before noticing that there were no children outside of the school, and that the twin wooden front doors were locked. Not good. He instantly took off once more, weaving his way in and out of the people he was passing, his rucksack bouncing against his back as he rushed across the grass to the concrete path that led to the stone steps that led up to said wooden doors. He was aware of being watched and looked up in time to briefly meet the eyes of Miss Birch, who was looking down from one of the second-story windows. He gulped slightly but didn't stop forcing himself to keep his pace as he reached the door. He pulled open the heavy door and made his way down the corridor. The school itself was fairly old and had been painted in beige framed by wood to emphasize the look. These pieces of wood had been in place since the school was built back in 1923, and had been greatly chipped away by time to the point that it looked like an actual pattern had been placed into the wood. The floors were smooth with an odd hexagon pattern crisscrossing it. The doors that lined the corridor were wooden with glass panels set in them upon which the room numbers painted. Further on set near the middle of the school was a staircase that led to the upper floor. It was large and wide with old concrete steps framed by a wooden base and rail of the same quality as the pieces that lined the walls. Instead of the usual lockers that occupied the halls of other schools, Lincoln had large coat room section opposite to the classrooms for the individual forms and various classes. The only exception to this was the changing rooms set up next to the gym that sat at the back of the school. This room was large and tiled with lockers lining the walls and floor, a few wooden benches thrown in for those who needed to sit down. The gym meanwhile was fairly large and painted an odd creme that hid the large bricks that formed the walls. The floor was a smooth wooden paneled one that had been added to hopefully give better grip. In truth, Harry believed it had been made this way to make it look more fancy for the inspections. This was the newest part of the school and had only recently been added. Well, recent was about 10 years. And properly stocked so as to free the main hall up for more assemblies. The classrooms meanwhile had nothing unique about them other than what exactly lined their walls. They were all basic room painted in the same beige of the corridors with a single blackboard and a single whiteboard set into the front of the classroom. There was a customary desk and swivel chair for whatever teacher was in the classroom, and a customary 24 desks that sat in rows of 4. There was a single cork board set into the wall next to the door which held announcements as well as the weekly newsletter and sign-up sheets for various clubs, next to which were where the displays were held. The teachers often took pride in their students' work or would set the task of the class making new displays as a lesson. The same went for the back wall. The final wall was a set of windows that were large enough to stretch from desk level to near the roof. Harry's classroom was the 5th one along, and therefore a distance from the door, which meant his running form gained quite the bit of attention from the classes he passed, the teachers shooting him disapproving looks. Harry gave a nervous look to each, quickly making his way down the large corridor. The man was of average height with a light brown wavy hairstyle. His eyes, while young, were slightly sunken and looked to be slightly haggard. He was wearing a faded blue suit that looked to be second-hand with the elbows patched up with a gray material, underneath which was a white shirt with the collar standing at an odd angle while the bottom was untucked. He looked tired, almost like he had not slept in a month. His body was slightly hunched over, almost like he didn't have the energy to fully stand up. Harry was momentarily worried that he had seriously hurt the guy and froze slightly before remembering why he was in a rush. He quickly stood, pulling his bag to his shoulder as he stood before the man. "Sorry," he quietly muttered before stepping around the man and entering his classroom's coat room. He hooked his bag before casting a brief look back at the man who had turned and was staring right back at him. Harry paused and stared in surprise at the man. Finally the elder turned away and walked around the corner. "What was that all about?" murmured Harry before bringing himself back to attention. He made his way to the door of his classroom and took a deep breath before pushing the door open. He turned his mouth already open to provide an explanation for his lateness, but paused momentarily in surprise as Mrs. Bell turned to him. "Oh, Harry, not again," she said as she gestured for him to enter. He did so without complaint and heard a few snickers from the class, much to his chagrin. She was the main teacher for the 4th grade and was at the moment heavily pregnant. She had been planning to take something called maternity leave for a while now, but had made the promise to remain on until a replacement teacher was found. Today she was unusually dressed up, and the slight tingly aroma that was tickling Harry's nostrils informed him that she was wearing perfume. She gave a brief glance behind him before turning her attention back to him. "No Dudley?" she questioned. Harry simply shook his head in answer. She sighed slightly before waving him in. "Come on now. Go take your seat." At her encouragement, Harry shut his slightly open mouth and gave a minute nod before heading to his desk, allowing the door to swing shut behind him. His desk was in the 3rd row and sat next to the window. It gave him the best view for daydreaming as it showed the many buildings of Gotham as well as the forest. He sat down without complaint and turned his attention to Mrs. Bell, who had waited until he had sat down before picking up where she had left off. "As I was saying, today I will be conducting interviews to find a replacement for while I'm gone. They will be coming in later this afternoon after a meeting with the head. After which they will come here and give a practice lesson for me and Mr. Dunbar to observe. Now, a few of them are fairly new to teaching, so I expect you all to behave accordingly. And yes, that means no spitballs." The kids groaned in mock disappointment, earning a slight smile from Mrs. Bell. Harry smiled slightly himself before glancing out of the window. It was a sunny day and the light was bouncing off the skyscrapers once again. The Wayne Enterprises building more prominent than any other as the light caught the massive W set on the top of the building. Harry sighed softly and allowed his mind to wander as Mrs. Bell carried on with her introduction speech. He was already aware of what to do and what not to do with new teachers, they were told every time they had a sub. It was a customary speech which was done as a pre-warning for the kids who just couldn't behave. If they went against it, they got detention or in worst-case scenarios a 3-day suspension. Really, Dudley was lucky he hadn't come in today. Well, maybe not Dudley, but Mrs. Bell, as he had a tendency to ignore all the rules and was the only child to have gotten that suspension. He had thought it was brilliant and had strived to get another one at the earliest convenience. It probably didn't help that Petunia had taken him out every day to places like the cinema and the zoo. Harry himself didn't really get how being given 3 days off from school was supposed to be a punishment, but then again most adults were weird. And this will last for around 20 minutes. Now I understand that you may not understand all the questions, but I would like you to answer all even if you don't know the answer. Remember, a guess is better than no answer at all. Harry snapped back to attention, his mind drifting in confusion for a few seconds before he realized exactly what she was referring to. The test. Harry thought, a small wave of panic running through him, with his uncle once again abandoning him this morning, as well as the general unfairness of how Harry was treated in comparison to Dudley. Again, really he had no true reason to worry, as he could recall a good portion of what they had been studying. However, like all children, the thought of a test made him groan. He didn't need nor want a test. He got they were there to apparently help, but honestly, he couldn't be bothered. He didn't really care how smart he was. Well, at least not when it cut into his daydreaming time. However, he surrendered to the fact that he wouldn't get out of this no matter how much he tried. He watched dully as Mrs. Bell moved around the room handing out the various tests to the students. Harry waited nervously as she came closer and closer until finally she passed his to him. He sighed slightly as he looked down at it. He really didn't want to do this. Right. Everybody ready? As she asked this, a few kids opened their desks to collect pen, Harry following suit. Okay, then you can begin now. Instantly the kids flipped the papers that had been handed out and began their own tests. Harry did the same at a slower pace. The test, he discovered, was quite easy, most of the questions based on subjects they had covered over the last few weeks. At one point, nearly halfway through, he glanced around the room and felt a small wave of disbelief over just how many kids were biting their lips in thought, some looking extremely lost as they stared at their papers. As funny as some of them looked, it didn't really help the boredom the young boy felt. Why was this test so easy? There was absolutely no challenge to it. At least for him there wasn't. He didn't feel any accomplishment as he completed his test or pride over the fact that he knew the answers. It was just too easy. Harry had always enjoyed a challenge. It made him feel the need to improve himself and encouraged him to continue. It would also catch his attention and make him feel like he had actually done something worthwhile. This test, heck, this school, it just bored him. The fact that he could spend his days daydreaming rather than paying attention to what they were learning and still find this test easy attested to the fact that there was no challenge here. Harry paused in his writing, his mind drifting away from the question he had been in the middle of answering to his usual thoughts. As he did so, he unconsciously turned to look outside the window, his eyes landing on the massive city that stretched out before him, just out of his reach. Truthfully, since he was little, Harry had always felt out of place. This, of course, was partially down to the Dursleys making it their mission to tell him such. That, and he was a freak, but that was only once after his primary school's teachers. Back in England, hair turned blue in the middle of the class. Harry had always thought that was an odd coincidence, as he had been extremely mad at her for ignoring him when it happened, and after this Vernon had quickly took his boss up on the promotion he was offered. But this feeling of being out of place came from a feeling. He wasn't sure what it was, but it always buzzed under his skin when he did his chores, almost as if it was criticizing him for doing such meaningless tasks. It was distracting and was often what led him to exploring or sitting on the school roof, it felt. What was that word Mrs. Bell said last week? Instinct tool? Instinctual. That was it. It felt instinctual, almost like he was drawn to it. It baffled the young boy to no end, but he always felt like he was meant for more than the Dursleys, than this school, than these people. Harry, he came back to himself and turned his face to find Mrs. Bell looking at him in concern. Everything all right? He froze slightly before giving a minute nod, then looked back down at his paper, pretending to go back to his test. Instead he fell back to the same thought track, his pen tapping slightly against the desk as he did so. Am I meant for more? His fists clenched while his eyes narrowed in concentration. His pen came to a stop and was held tightly by his hand. This was a thought that had always daunted him, along with the thought of what he was going to do when he was older. He had always been with the Dursleys, but he knew that none of his family held affection for him. As soon as he was 18 he would be kicked out and would be left to his own devices. That or Uncle Vernon would make good on one of his threats to take the boy to an orphanage. From how Vernon described it, the boy had no desire to even go within a small distance of the building. Then again, his uncle often exaggerated, but he had no way of being sure. If he had a choice, he would be someone who helped others, like a fireman, or maybe he could join the police. He didn't want the pointless job of those guys who worked in offices. He was positive that he would be beyond bored in such a position. He could try to do something in sports, maybe become a runner or something along those lines. He did get enough practice thanks to Dudley after all, but then again he didn't really want to be running for the rest of his life. At least in the police he could make a difference, even if it was only a small one. And if he was a fireman he could save people. He had to smile at that. Truly that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to help people. He wanted to be like those men who placed themselves in danger for others, those who weren't afraid of the bad guys. This, he decided, was his dream. But the question remained, what will I be? This thought plagued him for the rest of the morning as well as through both break and lunch. He ignored his sandwiches in favor of staring at the sky in thought. No answer came to him, and he found himself greatly troubled by the fact that he couldn't decide. When he thought of the emergency services, that buzz warmed slightly but not enough to encourage him. It was almost like he was missing something. The buzz was telling him he was meant for more if that was possible. But the problem was, meant for what? The bell rang out and he sat up, his eyes drooped in disappointment as he cast a last glance at the clear sky and his city before walking to the back of the roof. He was about to climb down when his stomach rumbled and reminded him of his sandwiches. He grumbled as he ran back across the roof to scoop them up and place them in his pocket before checking that the coast was clear. It was much to his relief. He grabbed hold of the old pipe and shuffled down, landing on the old bin a few seconds later. He jumped down from here and ran around the building, joining subtly with the mass of children who were reluctantly shuffling their way back into the school. She smiled ravishingly at them, all her light brown hair bouncing slightly near her shoulders. Harry noticed that her lips were redder than before, and it looked like she had straightened her dress. However, there was still a large bump indicating her pregnancy. "All right, class. Now remember your best behavior," she warned, and Harry sat a little straighter in his chair as he looked toward the door, which was still partly open. Nothing happened for a few seconds, then the head, Mr. Dunbar, a rotund man who suffered from high cardiovascular disease, whatever that was. Harry thought it was more important to remember that the man had already had a heart attack at the age of 45. He stood at around 5 feet 9 inches and had mostly gray hair with a few patches of brown as well as a bushy mustache. He entered wearing his customary brown suit, his lapels holding buttons with the school badge and other odd symbols. He came to stand near Mrs. Bell and looked behind him as a tall brown-haired man in a blue suit. Wait a minute. That was the guy Harry had bashed into this morning. He was one of their possibly new teachers? Harry was mortified and stared at the guy in horror. Perfect, he hadn't even found out his new teacher's new name yet, and the man probably already hated him. The man came to a stop next to Dunbar and turned to face the class, a smile on his face. His eyes drifted until they met Harry's, at which point he smiled even wider. Right behind him came 2 more men, the first of whom was tall with a bald head, dressed in a black suit, with his tie done up enough that Harry worried for a moment that it may be chalking him. He wore a stern face which bore absolutely no laugh lines. Harry, observing this and man's impressive height, which had to be around 6 feet 2 inches, decided he was incredibly scary looking. The next man was almost a complete opposite, who was short in stature and frame with a tweed suit hanging from his frame, a pair of wire-rimmed square spectacles hanging near the end of his nose. A woman brought up the end and shut the door behind her as she entered, tripping slightly over her own feet as she did so. She was dressed in a blue business suit with a plaited skirt, curly blonde hair bobbing every which way every time she moved. All three looked like the average supply teacher, standing straight-backed with a tinge of excitement and nervousness fluttering around them. Well, the woman and the first man did. The other two men seemed to be unemotional, with both wearing looks that did not inspire confidence. They came to stand next to the mysterious man, and like he before them, they cast their own glances around the class, and Harry noted that only the woman held the same spark in her eyes as the first. The other two seemed almost repulsed. Harry just stared back with worry all too obvious on his face. "Class," Mrs. Bell started before gesturing to the mystery man. "This is Mr. Mooney." She stopped as a few snickers were heard, some of the students trying to hold in smiles as they stared at the new faces. The snickers died down as Mrs. Bell's face hardened, showing she didn't approve. "Next to him is Mr. Beckett, Mr. Windle, and Miss Webb. They will be teaching you for the afternoon." As she finished, she turned to give Mr. Mooney an encouraging smile and gestured for him to walk forward. He did so without complaint and raised a hand to his face as he cleared his throat. "Hello, class, I'm Mr. Mooney. As you already know, as Mrs. Bell just introduced me." He started off confident, but the last part of the sentence was said to himself and earned a few snickers and an odd look from both Mr. Beckett and Windle. He paid them no notice and smiled in response before giving a glance over all of them. "As you can tell, I'm pretty new to teaching. And well, you are pretty new to learning." At the class appalled look, he continued, "Well, you are in comparison to me, who's been where you are. Believe me, it gets easier over time, but it depends upon your dedication. If you give it 100%, you can succeed in anything you do. But if you don't give your all and tend to goof about here," he glanced over at Harry, who blushed in response, "then you'll still do all right, but not as well as you would if you tried your best." The rest of the lesson went on like this, with the other three teachers stepping forward and giving similar speeches, Mr. Beckett's being the most intimidating of them all as he stood to his full height of 6 feet 2 inches and stared down at them with an impenetrable stare. In his own words, he described that any lessons with him would be structured to the point that if you didn't understand the topic by the end of the lesson, you could come back after school to catch up. Following this, Mr. Windle, the tweed guy, stepped forward and spoke with a voice that could give Dudley a run for his money, with how weedy it sounded. Told them how they would learn through specialized programs that had been recommended by the Board of Education. He went on to say more, but by this point Harry had lost all interest and had zoned out. His attention was only regained one more when Miss Webb stepped forward, and earned a snigger from the class when she tripped over her own feet, barely catching herself in time with a light blush. She, like Mr. Mooney, told the lass how she hoped to get to know them better and teach at a pace everyone would be comfortable with. After this, Mr. Mooney stepped forward once more. The other teachers, and possible teachers as it were, went to stand at the side of the class and allowed him to begin his lesson. Mr. Mooney proved to be pretty funny and successfully interacted with the class, who were actually volunteering answers to his questions, his relaxed manner quickly winning a large majority of them over, even if it did only win sneers from both Beckett and Windle. Mrs. Bell and Mr. Dunbar watched the interaction with smiles on their faces, and even joined in at points, much to Harry's amusement. And while this was a welcome but somewhat weary distraction from his earlier thought process, Harry couldn't wait until the bell rang. His eyes would flick to the clock every few seconds to find that it hadn't changed in the least bit. "Potter," Harry supplied, sinking upon himself slightly as the class turned to look at him. He had never liked answering questions in class. It made him a bigger target for bullying if he got answers wrong, or even right, which led to more problems for him. "I want to be a..." Momentarily put on the spot, Harry tried to stutter out an answer as his mind flashed back briefly to his own thoughts on the matter, earlier that very day. His mind raced, and there, in this moment of intense thought, an image from the newspaper of a man dressed as a bat flashed before his eyes and laced an ambition in his head. He barely prevented himself from saying it aloud as he said an earlier thought, "a firefighter." Even as he said this, a different word echoed in his mind, his eyes focusing back on his teachers. No one said anything for a moment, and Mr. Mooney had just opened his mouth to reply when a new voice rang out. "Yeah, right," one of the members of Dudley's gang shouted out with a large grin bursting out with laughter a moment later, the rest of the gang joining in after a few seconds. Harry blushed fiercely and shot a glare at them. Not that they noticed, as they were too busy laughing like a pack of hyenas. "You? The little freak of the school, a firefighter. What are you going to do? Hide from the fire? Ha, Mr. Fox." Mrs. Bell cut in, her voice sounding outraged and ringing out over the laughter. Harry's eyes narrowed as his fists clenched tightly enough that his hands began to tremble slightly. He was not a coward. He could save people. In fact, he would save people. He would show them all. As he mulled this, the rage that he kept carefully bottled up, carefully stored out of sight, erupted, and he felt his control lapse for just a moment and the buzz surge up with a wrathful vengeance and engulf his body like warm water. For a moment nothing happened and time seemed to slow to the boy. The bully's laughing head slowly rocking back and forward, his eyes tightly clenched shut, mouth open in delight. Then suddenly he was gone, slamming into the kid next to him, tipping the desk over and bringing them both to the ground. All laughter ceased and time focused once more, Harry recoiling along with the other children, his eyes wide. His fists loosened and he stared in shock at the groaning boys as the buzz and all its warming and frightening rage disappeared back to where they had come from. The teachers rushed forward, pulling the boys up, asking if they were all right and what happened. When it became apparent that the children were unharmed and what exactly happened was a mystery, Mrs. Bell suggested that Mr. Fox had done it to get out of trouble. The head agreed and forced the boy to walk with him to his office after apologizing to Mr. Mooney and the other teachers over the conduct of the student. Harry and the others just watched in bafflement, trying to figure just what the heck was going on. However, he shook off the thought as Mrs. Bell suggested they return to the lesson, Mr. Beckett taking over. The afternoon went on like this, with each teacher taking a turn at teaching in their own way. Mr. Beckett and Mr. Windles proving once again to be the scariest and most boring respectively, while Miss Webb followed more along the lines of Mr. Mooney, though her nervousness appeared to make her clumsy as she kept tripping over her own feet as well as knocking things from the teacher's desk. Finally, after what felt like forever, the bell rang, informing all that it was the end of the day. A cheer rang out and the children quickly gathered their objects and rushed for the door, some stopping to say bye to their possible new teachers, while others wearily edged around them. Mrs. Bell simply shook her head and said goodbye to each as they passed her at the door. Harry was a little slower than usual as he knew he didn't have a ride waiting for him. As such, he waited for the crowd to die down slightly before heading for the door. Just as he was about to cross the threshold, he felt a hand land on his shoulder, and he turned expecting to find Mrs. Bell. Instead, he found the concerned face of Mr. Mooney, who was looking critically over Harry's hand-me-downs. "Sir?" Harry questioned, his expression becoming worried as he turned to face his possibly new teacher. And Harry found himself looking up at him, barely coming to above his waist. "I was wondering if you were all right after what that boy said earlier," Mr. Mooney questioned. His voice was low and hushed, and Harry could sense rather than see that this man held a genuine concern for him. He nodded slightly in return. He was used to Dudley and his friends. Just because they were acting like jerks didn't mean that he would allow them to get to him. Well, more than they already did. Mr. Mooney paused and didn't look like he believed him, but relented and allowed Harry to walk away. As he did so, Harry couldn't resist the urge to look behind him. His mind was wandering once again as he looked at the man, barely hearing Mrs. Bell's parting words. He murmured a goodbye in return and headed over to the coat room. He quickly shouldered his rucksack and headed for the exit. It had been a long day, and for once he couldn't wait to get home. And wow, what a thought to actually be slightly looking forward to being in a confined space with the Dursleys. He really must be tired. As Harry walked, he dully noted that he would have to get through the crowds once more. This wasn't an exactly happy thought, but he had resigned himself to it nonetheless. He reached the old wooden doors and was out a moment later, his eyes taking in the busy streets. He paused for a moment before straightening himself up in preparation, then bravely marched down the concrete path to the streets. He could do this, he just needed to be brave, and besides, it wasn't like he had never been in a crowd before. He knew what to do, he wasn't afraid. Half an hour later, he regretted such thoughts. This is insane. Why is it so busy? The shops shut half an hour ago, he thought, even as he was smacked forward by a member of the crowd. He was knocked backwards a moment later and barely caught himself, turning sideways so as to allow another to pass. Suddenly he saw a gap in the crowd and ran forward with a small yell, just fitting through before someone else shut it off. He didn't stop, however, as he knew the danger of doing so, instead keeping the high-speed pace, his head tilted down slightly as he did so. He didn't stop until the crowd had thinned enough that he could walk without being thrown around like a beach ball. He came to a stop a minute later and briefly caught his breath, taking in his surroundings. While doing so, he noted that he was on the edge of the Narrows, much to his relief. The people may look creepier there, but at least they could avoid bumping into one another. And it was the quickest and easiest route home, with barely any traffic passing the roads he would be following. He walked forward dully, noting that the sky was going dark already, the sun moving on to the next city over. Typical really for Gotham, it got dark all too early when approaching winter. He ignored such thoughts as he continued forward, his eyes carefully watching his surroundings as he did so. He kept his head down, knowing not to make eye contact. He could already hear the shouts of gangs at this time of day, which was around 4 o'clock, but he couldn't be precise without a watch, which, while not completely unusual, suggested he should get a move on. He knew that gangs were just large groups of bullies, and he didn't want to be caught in the sights of one, especially not when it was getting dark. He picked up his pace and cast a glance over his shoulder as his paranoia suggested he keep an eye on all of his sides. This served to make the boy more paranoid than actually comforted, and everyone became a threat. He left a large gap between himself and a woman who was standing on the corner of the street under one of the few street lamps. She shot him a smile, and Harry forced himself to look away as he quickly crossed the road. He continued up the street and was just about to turn a corner when he heard a yell. Stopping, he looked around as another cry rang out. He turned until his eyes landed on an alleyway set between two buildings on the opposite street. There was a gang there made up of older teens. They were stood in a circle and looked to be staring down at something. Suddenly a few of them moved in and started throwing punches at whatever it was, and a loud hoarse scream rang out. Harry took a step back and stared at them in shock. They were beating someone up, and by the looks of it they were enjoying it. The teens were laughing, the girls jeering on the boys who were doing said beating. The gang, while not massive, was with around 8 or 9 of them in total, and from the looks of it, they were all wearing leather jackets with a drawing of a dragon on the back, the words "Red Dragons" scrawled below it. Where they had come up with that name he had no idea, but it sounded like something out of a cartoon. They should be called the Bully Brigade or something. Okay, even to him that sounded extremely lame, but he was panicking here. His wit didn't do well under pressure. He watched and felt that same buzz once more, a light temporarily taking the feeling of fatigue away. It demanded that he stop watching and take action, but he couldn't. He was just a kid, and there was about 8 of them. What was he supposed to do? Beat them up with insults? Besides, whoever was getting beat up probably deserved it. It wasn't that he was being a coward, it was the fact that he wouldn't make a difference even if he tried. Even to him this sounded false, and he felt a tightening in his gut as his muscles shook. Okay, so maybe he was afraid, but he was just 8 years old. Heck, he was a malnourished 8-year-old. He should just carry on walking, let the gang deal with whoever it was. If they were lucky, a police squadron might even pass by and save them. Yeah, just walk away. The point of whimpers. And Harry watched in horror as they rained down more blows. He's just an old man. They're hurting an old man, Harry thought as his fists clenched at his sides. I have to. He tried to think, but he couldn't. His mind wouldn't stop racing. It was as if all answers had just decided to abandon him. What do I do? He thought desperately, trying to grasp onto an answer, until finally he came to the conclusion that he had to go get help, find a call box and get the police. Yeah, that was the sane plan. However, when he started running, it wasn't in the opposite direction. He crossed the street, not caring if any cars were heading his way, and used his own momentum to slide himself against a dumpster that sat at the entrance of the alley. What am I doing? What the hell am I doing? He thought to himself as he peeked around the edge. None of the gang had noticed him yet, which was a plus. But now what the hell was he supposed to do? Throw his backpack at them? Well, there was an idea. He looked down at the bag, which was currently being held to his chest. It was pretty heavy today with school books, so it might actually make an impact. Right, so the plan was throw backpack, which somehow magically saves the old man. Yeah, and then the gang turns its attention to him and he gets beaten to a bloody pulp. Good plan, Potter. Grrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr his backpack. I have to act now or the guy might die. He peeked around the bin and readied himself, clenching his legs in preparation as he looked at them. Okay, Potter, just throw the bag and run. That'll get them away from the old man and after you. Wow. I'm so not liking this plan. He pulled back and shut his eyes, gulping slightly before starting to move. He stopped as he heard a pained cry, only this one was obviously female. Huh? He thought in confusion, peeking around the edge once more to find that it was one of the girls who had been egging on the beating earlier. She was now on the floor and looked. Harry felt a shudder run down his back and couldn't look away even as it moved to glide down its arms stretching out like wings. It looked almost like a bat, But that meant, Batman. Harry breathed in a hushed whisper of awe, leaning further around the edge to watch. His hands pushing against the metal to keep himself upright as he did so, his backpack laying in his lap forgotten. The shadow collided with the teens, taking one out with its outstretched legs, the others scrambling back like rats. It stood hunched for a moment, then slowly straightened, allowing its cloak of black to shift like water along its back. The gang looked beyond horrified as they watched. Then suddenly some of the braver, or rather stupider boys let out a battle cry and ran at it head-on. He was down a moment later as a strong right jab landed on his chin, making him spin slightly in the air before he landed on the concrete. He wasn't out, however, and made to stand once again, even as the other boys who had been egged on by his actions charged. The shadow was still and waited until they had thrown their first punches. It moved, allowing them to harmlessly pass by as it shifted, so its hand could grab the outstretched wrist. It then pulled, flinging one into the original attacker who had just made it off the floor where they lay unmoving, before twisting so as to duck another and swept its leg out to trip the attacker. The boy fell with a girlish scream and was only silenced when a booted foot kicked out and made contact with his face. Harry was grinning from ear to ear, his eyes fixed on the scene as watched, completely captivated by the sight. The last two made a go at attacking together, but the shadow was obviously a better fighter, as it deflected one of the blows into the other's face, then pulled back his own arm and allowed a punch to sail forward, sending the other skidding across the floor. Harry sat there grinning and was contemplating moving when he noticed something. There had been 3 girls earlier, so where? His eyes found her a few feet away with a metal bar tightly held within her hands. She was carefully moving forward, her arm pulling back, ready to swing. Harry didn't think, he just acted. "Look out!" he yelled as he stood ready to run at her. There was no need, as the shadow twisted a kick, swinging around to meet the girl head on. As it did so, suddenly everything stilled, and Harry, breathing heavier than normal, looked toward it and gave a small gasp. Now that the man was facing him, he could see him properly even in the dull lighting, and couldn't help but feel amazed. He knew, of course, he should be intimidated. This was, after all, Batman, the man that all criminals in Gotham had learned to fear, but he couldn't help but stare in awe. This was Batman, and he had just taken down those guys. This was so cool. Batman returned the look, and Harry felt as if the man was cocking an eyebrow at him beneath his mask. But the boy didn't care and couldn't help the wide-eyed awe that spread across his face. They stayed like this for a moment, and unknown to the other, they both felt like a bolt of lightning had just struck them, a feeling of understanding. The moment ended only when Batman broke the eye lock as he pulled some device from a belt around his waist and pointed it at the rooftops. A moment later it snagged and pulled the man up into the shadows. Harry stared up after him but couldn't find his form among the night sky. His hands hung loose at his sides as he stared up and felt a feeling of belonging blossom. The words he had thought to himself earlier in class came back to him, and he stared at the night sky as they drifted past his lips. I want to be a hero. He never noticed the dark shadow that observed him from its perch on the rooftop. A helping hand. Gotham City, November 3rd, 1729 Eastern Daylight Time. Harry gasped slightly before running forward. Hey, stop. He skidded once he had made it to the man's side, coming to a stop. He then kneeled down while placing his hands on the man. "Sir, you've been injured. You need to stay still." He rushed out as the man flinched and tried to roll away. The action resulted in another pained cry. Harry was panicking now and pushed harder on the man's shoulder, trying to keep him still with his weight. It resulted in a slightly louder cry, and Harry pulled his hands back, looking down with a mix of sheepishness and fear on his face as he muttered, "Sorry." The pain left the blue orbs momentarily as they widened, showing a large amount of shock. The elder's hands trembling slightly where they were lay near his head. Harry's own eyes widened, and he felt his eyebrows shoot up as he stared back, feeling incredibly puzzled at the look the other was giving him. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Suddenly the pain returned, and the eyes lost some of their width but did not break the gaze as the man's hand shakily rose up, the trembling revealing how much the action was hurting. But the old man looked entranced. Harry felt much the same way, watching in amazement as the limb slowly reached out to him until it rested against his right cheek. The shaking and the sheer coldness sending a jolt of fear through him. This was bad. He needed to get help. He needed to call an ambulance or yell for help, or just... He couldn't move. He couldn't act as he stared deeply into those eyes, as he watched the jolts of pain flicker across that aged face. The man gasped and his mouth twitched slightly, only a broken sound making it through. He appeared to be struggling and Harry couldn't do anything. He couldn't move. Why couldn't he move? Chihiro RGG. The man's mouth moved awkwardly, letting out odd wet noises as he attempted to say something. He stopped momentarily and Harry watched as a pink tongue breathily flicked out to gently trace along the chapped, broken lips. Ruby, B.G. In the words were slowly drawn out, the sound of gurgling accompanying them as the man's eyes flickered open and shut, almost like a wave of fatigue had hit him. He was positive that you weren't supposed to let beat-up people go to sleep. As such, in his panicked state, the boy resorted to taking a hold of the bony shoulders and shaking him. He shook him and shook him but got no response. The head just lolled weightlessly. His breathing became heavy and panicked as he got more aggressive. Wake up. Come on, wake up. He was trembling and his hands were pushing on the man's side as he tried to push the man to lie on his back. Harry had seen lifeguards push on someone's chest on TV and wanted to try the movement, however he could not push the other over. The man, even with his thin frame, was too heavy and his body hung limply, almost as if he had no bones at all. His face was also slowly relaxing, though a grimace would appear every few seconds, like the man was still conscious. Help! Somebody help! He shouted at the top of his voice, hoping that Batman would return and help him, or that someone would hear his cry and decide to answer it. His voice was desperate, and when it became apparent that no one was coming, Harry cast a glance to the rooftop, which still lay bathed in shadows and empty. The little boy felt his eyes begin to sting as tears pricked at the corners, demanding a release as his bottom lip began to tremble. He roughly wiped them away with the back of his fist as he went back to shaking the man. Please wake up. Come on. Please, he muttered as he kneeled there, a few tears unknowingly falling from his eyes and dragging down his face. Help! Somebody please. Help! His voice was broken, and he stared down at the man whose breathing was slowing and becoming minor with each breath. The normal sounds of the Narrows echoed like a far-off song in the distance, everything around them remaining still and almost dead. There was the slight sound of breathing behind him, which reminded him of the alley's other occupants, though he stubbornly resisted the urge to glance back at them. No one was coming. No one was coming to save the day. A siren broke the stillness, and Harry turned around, catching the approach of flashing red and blue lights at the entrance of the alley, suggesting that a patrol car would be passing in a few seconds. Not thinking, Harry stood and ran for the entrance and didn't stop once they're skidding, instead to stop in the middle of the road with his arms fully outstretched at his sides. What the dash? Shouted the driver, who barely turned in time to miss the boy and bring the car onto the luckily empty path. It swerved unevenly as he stomped down on the brake and attempted to steer it out of a spin. It luckily worked and came to a stop a few feet away from where the boy stood, having narrowly missed him and the old concrete wall of an apartment building. Dust wafted up in its wake, making it look like the tires had burned a path from braking. Harry stared in shock, the thought that he had almost just killed himself playing in the back of his mind, even as he ran over to the car as the police officer stepped out, grasping the top of the door firmly in his hand. He looked young, with a clean-shaven jaw and a small build hidden beneath the standard dark blue GCPD uniform. Kid, are you crazy? What the hell did you think you were? He cut himself off as Harry grabbed a hold of his left wrist and started to pull on it, trying to get the man to move. Hey, what are you? Let go of me, he demanded as he reaffirmed his feet, hoping to dissuade the child. However, Harry just pulled harder, his own feet sliding uselessly against the ground as he tried to pull the man to the alleyway. Come on, got to hurry, he huffed out as he pulled all the harder, his arms straining as he did so, his teeth tightly gritted. As neither moved, he mentally started to curse his small, malnourished body and the lack of muscle. He turned his face to see the officer was clinging all the tighter to the door. Harry's face became pleading, and he felt his lower lip begin to tremble slightly once more. Please, look here, you little brat, started the officer, gritting his teeth in anger as he forcefully pulled his arm back, pulling it out of the boy's clutches as he stared down at him. Harry took a step back, his eyes widening in fear as he held his legs at a ready position. He recognized the look and knew he might have to make a run for it. That's enough. Both stopped their actions and looked up. Well, for Harry it was up. For the officer it was sideways, to see another man stepping out of the passenger seat of the car. He was a tall African-American, dressed in a pair of plain black pants along with a white shirt and black tie. Over the shirt there was a black holster that crisscrossed his shoulders and arms, a gun of some kind holstered on the left. He was fairly young looking himself and was at the moment shooting disapproving glances at the officer. The officer in turn gulped slightly and had the mind to look guilty as he released his death grip on the car door. But sir, we were en route to a crime scene. This kid just jumped in the way, he lamely tried to explain as he cast a brief glance at Harry, who was staring between them with worry. The other had none of it and narrowed his eyes on the officer as he leaned against the top of the car, his hands bracing him as he glared. A call's just come in for this street, Commissioner said. It's top priority, replied the other. The officer's eyes widened in understanding while Harry just stood there sure he had missed something. Seeing his message had got across to the other, he turned to look down at the boy. He then pushed off the car and took slow, careful steps until he came around it to stand at the back of the car. He kept eye contact with the boy and made sure that the child could see him approaching. Then when only a few feet away, he knelt so as to be on level with the boy and gave him a kind smile. Hi, my name's Detective Bennett. As he said this, he pulled a badge from his belt and held it before Harry, who stared at it in amazement. The shiny surface looking bronze under the glow of the street lights. Can you tell me your name? He asked carefully as Harry looked up at him with weariness all too present in his eyes. Harry wasn't sure about this. His uncle had always criticized those of different nationalities, especially when they couldn't hear him. And Petunia had always warned Dudley not to go near anyone who was a different ethnic group. But at his school, Harry had been told that everyone had equal rights and that those who criticized others for their skin color were called racists. These two teachings clashed in the boy's mind before Harry decided to just shove both away. He then turned his own eyes on the man before him and the kind smile. He gulped slightly and hoped he was right before opening his mouth. And my name's Harry, he murmured uncertainly. The man smiled even wider, showing a few of his white teeth. Harry? Wow, that's a good name. Well, Harry, can you tell me where you were going to take Officer Bowles? Local medic to be sent here. Apparently the man knew better than to argue, as he simply did as asked. He listened to the radio for a few moments before looking up to the now kneeling Bennett, who was carefully looking over the man before him. They say she won't be here for another 10 minutes. They're sending a van to pick up the scumbags, he replied before casting a small glance over at Harry. Should I ask for child services to be sent out? Bennett looked over at Harry, who couldn't hide the panic that spread over his face. If child services showed up, then they would contact his aunt and uncle, and he would no doubt get into trouble. I'm so dead. If they find out A warm hand was placed on his shoulder, and the young boy looked up to see it was Bennett with a warm smile on his face. No. There's no need for that. Just go get some handcuffs from the car and start cuffing the kids. That way if any of them wakes up before the van gets here, we won't have to chase after them, will we? He said as he looked over at the boy before casting a brief glance at Bowles, who paused for a moment to regard the two before giving a curt nod and leaving to get the spare handcuffs. Harry smiled gratefully at the man, who gave a grin back and briefly gave the boy's shoulder a light squeeze in comfort before withdrawing his hand and turning to face the old man once more. Harry turned his attention as well to the old man before carefully kneeling down himself, ignoring the dirt that would stain his large pants. He looked down at the elder and began to panic once more upon noticing the pale texture of his skin. Will he be all right? He stuttered slightly as he spoke, a cold draft making its way down the alleyway as Bennett turned to look at him once more. Harry had never felt so much resentment for himself as he kneeled there, his eyes narrowing in anger both to himself and those who had attacked the man. Why hadn't he intervened? Why was he such a coward? Batman hadn't had to sit there and psyche himself up. He simply attacked, never hesitating in his actions. He had always wanted to be a hero, but how could he when he was such a coward? Mr. Fox had been right today. Harry would most likely hide if faced with danger. He had always done so, whether it was Dudley and his friends or as simple as answering a question in class. He had done so today, giving a false answer in favor of the true one. He had done this because he was afraid he would be laughed at for the truth. Heck, he had been laughed at for the false answer because no one would ever believe that the little freak of the school could possibly be a firefighter. No, he was too much of a coward to be anything of the sort. Harry's eyes had clenched shut at this point, and his fists were clenched so tightly that the knuckles were a prominent white against the rest of his skin. They were trembling lightly as he mentally criticized himself. Suddenly he felt a warm hand on his shoulder once more and unconsciously leaned in slightly before turning to stare at Bennett, his eyes wide and tears brimming in the corners. Hey! Come on, none of this was your fault, Harry sniffed and gave Bennett a disbelieving look. The detective gave him a wider smile. Okay. Did you beat him up? Harry paused before shaking his head right. Did you encourage the beating? Again a shake of the head. Bennett raised his hand and rested it on top of Harry's head. Then it's not your fault. But I saw what was happening. I could have. Harry trailed off, not even sure how he should finish his own sentence. You couldn't have done anything. These guys are teenagers. As he said this, he gestured behind him, and Harry followed the hand to see some of the teens were now propped against the wall as Officer Bowles moved to cuff those who were left. You're just a kid. If you had got in the way, they would have turned their attention to you, Bennett finished, hoping to comfort the boy. Unknown to him, it did the opposite. So just because they were older than me, he thinks I shouldn't get involved? Thought Harry as he glanced back at the old man. That can't be right. He couldn't just abandon others because those who were bullying them were bigger than him, which made absolutely no sense. If he had just moved faster, if he had just had a bit more courage, he could have helped. He knows he could have helped, or at the least he liked to think he could have. But no, he had done nothing, and now this old man may die. Thank you, said Bennett in a stern tone before pointing to the entrance of the alleyway. Why don't you go keep lookout for that medic as well as that van you ordered? Bowles seemed to deflate even more as he turned and slowly walked away with a small yes, sir. Harry would have normally found such a situation amusing, but at this moment he couldn't really care less as he kneeled there watching Bowles' retreating form. Suddenly he felt a large hand wrap around his wrist, and he looked up to see Bennett was the one tugging on it. Not sure what the man was up to, Harry carefully loosened his fist and allowed it to be turned over by Bennett. Then he felt something light and metallic being pushed into his hand and looked down to find the oddly shaped object. He gasped slightly as he finally made out the shape. It was a bat. Looking up, he saw that Bennett was once again smiling at him, his dark brown eyes holding a spark of mischief in them. This is a batarang, he stage whispered to Harry, who looked between him and the object in confusion. It's one of the weapons that Batman uses. Really? Harry practically shouted as a look of excitement bloomed on the boy's face. This belonged to Batman. He was holding something of Batman's. The boy barely kept himself from shouting further as Bennett quickly shushed him while casting a brief glance over his head to see if Bowles had heard. Luckily, it appeared that the youth had wandered back to the car to carry out his allotted task. Or just to sit there rather than wait in the cold. Once he was sure the other hadn't heard, he gave a nod to the boy's question as he smiled all the wider. Can you keep a hold of it for me? I don't really have anywhere to put it at the moment, he said as he pushed the object fully into the child's hand. Harry froze, looking like a deer in headlights. He was being asked to look after something that belonged to Batman? He felt a mixture of fear and excitement blossom in his chest as his hands began to lightly shake. But what if I break it? Harry questioned as he looked down at it in worry. He really didn't want to part with it, but he wasn't sure if he could be trusted. Bennett actually laughed slightly. I don't think that'll be an issue. Bats makes these out of some pretty tough metal. And look here, he nodded to the item, and Harry looked down towards it, watching in fascination as Bennett folded the metal up. Harry gasped in amazement and looked back at Bennett. It folds for easy storage, finished Bennett. Then cautiously he cast another glance around, then met the eyes of the boy. But we have to keep this between us, okay? It's our little secret, he whispered. Harry quickly nodded and placed the object into the pocket of his overly large black pants, his hand remaining with it even as he stared at Bennett. The staring contest that had begun between the two stopped as the faint screech of tires and a siren was heard behind them. Turning, Harry watched as an old ambulance pulled up at the entrance, the old siren flashing at them. The front passenger door swung open and an elderly lady hopped down, a man rounding the front to join her a moment later. Bennett stood to greet the approaching duo, and Harry followed suit, clutching the batarang tightly within his pocket. Dr. Thompkins, he said in greeting, stepping back as he did so to give her a clear path. At the same time he placed a hand on Harry's shoulder, the slight tugging indicating the boy should follow. He did so without argument and watched as the woman rushed past them both. She was carrying a black bag of some kind that was clasped shut by an odd metal clip. Bennett, she murmured as she kneeled next to the elderly man, pulling out a stethoscope to listen for a heartbeat. The young man who had followed her and also kneeled was carefully looking over the man. We have a heartbeat, she said as she looked at the other. The man nodded and pushed himself to his feet and rushing back to the entrance of the alleyway. Sir, she called carefully as she gently shook the man's shoulder. When she was given no response, she tried again, raising her voice as she did so. Sir, can you hear me? Again no response came, and she looked behind herself to Bennett and Harry, who were still standing there. "Bennett, do we have a name?" "No, not at the moment," he replied slowly before turning slightly to look down at Harry. "Do you know his name?" Harry looked up at him in surprise before shaking his head slightly, his eyes silently apologizing as he returned his gaze to the still unmoving old man. He was shaking slightly as he watched, a feeling of fear bristling within his chest. He didn't want the old guy to die. "Sorry, I just saw he was in trouble and ran over. I've never met him before." Both Bennett and the lady looked at him in surprise as he spoke. His voice was soft but truthful, and he received smiles for his effort. "Well," the old lady had started, her voice taking a slightly more light tone as she spoke to him, "that was very kind of you." Harry smiled at that, his eyes lighting up with happiness as he looked up at Bennett for confirmation. His action was halted, however, as he Harry gave a small nod in answer. However, Bennett was already moving toward the entrance of the alleyway, turning to sidestep as the young man from before passed him, while wheeling a bed of some kind toward them. "Set it there, Tom," the lady said as she stood from her position while pointing to a spot next to the old man. Tom did as instructed and placed the bed before messing with a lever of some kind that made it drop closer to the ground. Harry watched in fascination and was going to move closer when the woman shot him a look that made him freeze in place, his hand unconsciously clenching tightly around the batarang. "Tom, go get one of those men to help," she instructed, and did a sweep of the man with her fingers. She appeared to be looking for something, but Harry didn't understand exactly what. Tom didn't argue and turned to head to the entrance once more, this time running as he did so, his footsteps lost to the loud sirens that were still blaring. Harry could hear the screech of tires and was looking toward the entrance with worry. Maybe he should have left earlier like Batman. Now he would most likely get in trouble for being here. He felt anxious, and the sound of loud chatter as well as a loud voice barking orders did not fill him with much confidence. He was now casting looks between the entrance and the old man. He didn't really want to leave him, but at the same time he didn't really want to be here. Bennett had also told him to wait here, which wasn't helping the boy decide any quicker. He liked the older man, but at the minute he was on his own and feeling frightened as he watched the events around him. His worry became all the more visible as he started to awkwardly shuffle his feet as he fidgeted with his hands, the right tracing the folded piece of metal in his pocket. After a few moments, Tom appeared once more, this time with a young male officer Harry didn't recognize. They both rushed over to the woman and ignored Harry's presence. This suited the boy just fine as he took a step backwards, hoping to get out of the way without gaining any notice. "Carefully turn, then lift him," she ordered as she too took a step back and closely observed the two try not to jostle him. They did as instructed and grabbed the old man at either end before carefully turning him over, then lifted him onto the bed. Once he was there, the officer took a step back of his own while Tom fiddled about with the bottom of the bed once more. It lifted a few seconds later and was on a normal height level once more. Once this was done, Dr. Thompkins came closer and helped Tom fasten a series of belts over the old man, which secured him upon the bed, then gestured for the officer to move closer once again. The officer did, and was soon helping Tom push the bed towards the entrance and past a number of other officers who were now entering the alleyway and heading towards the still unconscious teens. The doctor followed closely behind them, and Harry, after a split second of indecision, also followed, making sure to keep a minor gap between them. The others took no notice and continued on, and soon they were near the entrance. Harry then took notice of his forgotten backpack that still lay next to the large dumpster. It was lying on the ground limply, with only a slight bulge revealing the books inside. Bending down, Harry scooped it up and shouldered it, clenching the straps tightly in his hands as he did so as he moved to exit the alleyway. Looking around, he took notice that there were a lot more police than he had expected, with 3 squad car as well as a large van now sitting in the street, in addition to the still parked ambulance that the old lady and her party were heading for. However, it was times like this when Harry used his small stature to his advantage as he carefully made to head in the opposite direction. If he was lucky, he could get out without getting noticed, then make it home and act like nothing had happened. "Hey you! Hold it there, Shrimpy!" called a loud and obnoxious voice. Harry balked slightly as it did so and slowly turned to face the source. Before him stood a tall man dressed in a sweat-stained shirt and black pants as well as a large brown raincoat. He looked rather rough, with a 5 o'clock shadow around his mouth and a large beer belly. He had an old fedora hat on his head, greasy black locks peeking out around the edges. His face was slightly pudgy with many frown lines and a set of small beady black eyes. In his hand he held a half-eaten glazed donut, pieces of which were currently falling to the ground. He looked incredibly unfriendly and was gritting his teeth at Harry as the boy stared up at him with large round eyes. He couldn't help it as he began to tremble in fear, his hands tightening further over the straps of his bag.
¿Yes?
Asked Harry, his voice shaking along with him as he resisted the urge to cry. The man before him was extremely large despite having nothing on his uncle's weight problems. Even so, Harry's little buzz made itself known, and the boy instantly knew it didn't like this man. However, that didn't really help the boy, who barely came to the guy's waist. "Where do you think you're going?" the guy demanded, spit escaping his mouth along with his booming voice. He was full on glaring down at the wide-eyed child who was resisting the very tempting urge to run. He had seen enough TV to know that running from the police only led to bad things, and while he might vaguely know the streets, they have cars and by definition were way faster than he was. And he didn't want to rile this guy more than he apparently had. Even so, he really didn't want to be in the presence of the man any more than he had to. He was currently looking scarier than anything Harry had ever faced, and that included Vernon in a very bad mood, which was extremely hard to beat. Harry wanted gone, and that meant he would have to explain his presence. Even with that thought in mind, he struggled to form a sentence. I was. The man didn't look amused and was now sneering down at the boy while folding his arms over his chest. I was, he mocked out as he looked down at Harry, who shrank further in response. "You were, what? Part of the gang? Ha! Bet you were egging them on, weren't you, kid? And the old bat freak didn't realize and left you alone. Well, I won't make that mistake." As he growled this out, he grabbed a hold of one of Harry's much smaller wrists and forcefully wrenched the boy's arm as he started to drag him along. Harry let out a startled yelp and gasped slightly in pain as he was dragged toward one of the cars. The other's barking voice had drawn a lot of attention, and now many of the officers were looking over in confusion. Harry felt tears prickle in his eyes as he tried to pull his wrist free, tripping over his own feet every now and again as he struggled. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this man being so mean? Wasn't he a police officer, one of the good guys? Stop. Let me go. I didn't do anything, shouted Harry as he was pulled closer to the car. He was going to be in so much trouble when his aunt and uncle found out. It wouldn't matter that he hadn't been involved or the fact that he had been trying to help that man. No, all that would matter to his aunt and uncle would be the so-called shame. By getting involved rather than walking straight home, Harry had gone against what they told him to do, and therefore his actions had resulted in embarrassing his family once more. He could already hear his aunt complaining about what the neighbors would think, as well as Vernon's complaints of never being so embarrassed in his whole life. He could hear Dudley's taunts and imagine the rumors at school. His eyes clenched shut and tears began to fall, and the buzz became even more prominent, demanding release. Harry gasped slightly to himself and was releasing his control, ready to let whatever it was out. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Harry's eyes shot open and were alight with hope as he turned his head to see Bennett approaching them, looking ready to kill the much larger man. Harry felt wave upon wave of relief wash over him as he looked up at the detective, his eyes watering now in happiness as the other came to a stop and Harry could finally stand on his feet properly once more. The larger man turned to sneer once again, eyeing Bennett like he wasn't worth his time as his grip slackened slightly on the boy's wrist. "Don't get in my way, Bennett. I'm arresting a suspect and taking him back to HQ for questioning." He growled out, some spit coming to land on Bennett's face. "Suspect?" questioned Bennett, looking incredulous as he stared at the larger male as if he had grown another head. "He's just a kid. A kid who, by the way, tried to help the victim." Bennett returned, baring his teeth at the other as he stared up at him, his arms tensed at his sides with his fists tightly clenched in anger. "Oh, and how do you know that?" "For all we know, he could have been the reason behind the attack," replied the man, stepping closer to Bennett as if he was trying to intimidate him. Bennett, however, wasn't bothered and actually matched the step so that he was standing directly next to the man, his eyes narrowing at him. "Oh, come off it, Bullock. Are you that desperate for a closed case that you're actually going to peg a full-fledged gang attack on a kid who doesn't look like he's over 7? We have the attackers. Batman was here and took care of them. Me and Bowles already had them handcuffed for when you finally decided to show up." Bennett shot at the man apparently called Bullock, who got even madder if that was possible. His hand again tightening around Harry's wrist, making the young boy gasp in pain as he grabbed at the large hand with his other, hoping to pry his wrist free. "Why, you—" "Enough!" Bullock's retort was halted as both he and Bennett turned to find an irate-looking Dr. Thompkins standing with her hands on her hips and looking ready to smack their heads together. "You two will cut out this childish behavior before I make you cut it out. And you hear," she pointed to Bullock, who looked disgusted by how she was speaking to him. "You will let go of that child's wrist right this instant." Here her voice had become steely. However, Bullock took no notice as he glared at her. "And why should I? Because you're damaging his wrist, and if you carry on you will lose that badge you cherish so much. Don't forget, detective," here she sneered, her voice sounding harsher if possible as her eyes narrowed, making her appear similar to one of those wild cats who were about to pounce on an unsuspecting prey, "that I happen to personally know your benefactor and can ask him to stop funding your force for child abuse." Bullock took in a large amount of air through his nose and faintly reminded Harry of a dragon before it spewed its flames, while drawing back and making himself appear taller. Then he cast a glance down at Harry, and then down at his other hand, which still held the glazed donut, only now it had been crushed inside of his large fist, small crumbs falling through the gaps in his fingers. Angered once more, now more due to his lack of self-control, he gave a small snarl before pushing slightly while releasing the boy's wrist. Harry, who had not been expecting the action or the strength of the motion, fell to the floor, his left hand instantly flying to his wrist. As he did so, he began to rub it gently, however couldn't help the cringe he felt as he rubbed the reddening flesh. He now had a large red hand print surrounding the area, and he could feel exactly where the fingertips had been digging in. The wrist still felt like the hand was there, and Harry couldn't help the small hiss he let out as air ghosted over it. The floor was cold beneath him, and he could feel the concrete digging harshly into his backside, as well as the stares of all those around him, the police force having come to a complete halt to watch the spectacle. He didn't want this. He didn't want everyone staring at him like he was a freak. He just wanted to go home, to go up to his room and barricade the door shut and be left alone. But he couldn't move. His legs had frozen, and he felt the onslaught of more tears approaching as he began to shake, his rucksack clinging to his back as one of the straps moved to inch down his arm. Warm hands landed on his shoulders, and he looked up to find Bennett looking down at him with a sad smile. Harry couldn't force himself to return it and looked away. Bennett's smile instantly dropped, and he looked toward Dr. Thompkins, who motioned for him to follow her. He understood the gesture for what she truly meant and carefully placed his hands beneath the boy's armpits before lifting him into his arms. Harry unconsciously stiffened his left hand, tightening around his wrist, as he did so, causing another minor hiss of discomfort as he was carried away from Bullock and the eyes of the many police officers. Bennett in reaction also stiffened but forced himself to relax. Harry wished he could follow suit, but his body wouldn't let him. He had never been carried before, and the whole experience was completely flabbergasting to the young boy. It was to some degree enjoyable not having to walk, but at the same time this simple action put him on edge along with heightening his panic levels. He tried to calm down and managed to loosen his legs slightly, however other than that he remained stiff and unmoving. He watched as Bennett followed Dr. Thompkins, who led them to the front of the old ambulance. She used the step set into the door to help pull herself in before signaling for Bennett to place Harry inside. He did so without fuss, and Harry had to lift his arms over the man's head as his nerve endings refused to let go. He was placed upon a comfy leather seat that was way too big for him. Bennett, who had yet to move away, pulled the seat belt down and clicked it into place for the boy before leaning in slightly, so only Harry could hear him. "Remember our little secret, yeah?" the man asked with a smile, and unconsciously Harry felt panic begin to bloom, his hand racing to his pocket to find that he could still feel the piece of metal through his thin pants. He gulped slightly before giving Bennett a small nod of confirmation that earned a brief tussle of hair before the man gave him one last smile, then shut the door. Silence fell into the cab, and Harry felt slightly awkward as he gently rubbed his wrist. He turned slightly to see that the doctor wasn't paying attention to him, instead doing up her own belt before starting the engine. The vehicle vibrated as she did so, and Harry tensed slightly, his hands going to grip the belt as he felt the ambulance begin to move. He had never been in a car that vibrated before, and as such he believed there was good reason for it. She pulled out into the empty street and clicked the siren on as she began to move, Harry sitting tense beside her and staring out of the front window. His wrist ached dully, but he refused to lessen his death grip upon the seat belt for fear of what he would be chancing if he did so. His eyes were fixed upon the road, and he was praying that this would be a short journey. Trying to distract himself, he stiffly turned his head away and looked outside the passenger window. They were passing a series of old derelict flats, as well as a series of houses that Harry didn't recognize. He realized then that they had gone further into the Narrows and to a section where Harry had never traveled before. Everything looked darker here if possible. There was a lack of light and the buildings were a lot closer together than usual. The roads also looked as though they were never used, lacking even the basic white line that showed the separation of the lanes. Harry usually only went the direct path from the bridge to the house. He also tended to use that area for his explorations. He had for all intents and purposes believed that all of the Narrows was the same and as bad as the part he ventured through. However, now looking around he could see that he had been wrong. There were many people on the streets here using cardboard boxes to shelter from the harsh cold air. Some sat alone while others had whole families sheltered under them. Harry couldn't help but stare as they passed a pair of children who were huddled together shivering as they leaned upon one another for support. Their clothes were greatly torn and Harry had never before been so grateful for his large hand-me-downs. His tight grip loosened and he twisted slightly in his seat, trying to keep his gaze on them even as they moved further away. However, soon he had lost them and reluctantly he turned away, looking down as he did so. He didn't look up again until he felt the ambulance arch upwards and looked through the large front screen to see that they were entering into a garage. It was large and the door, which appeared to be automatic, was rising up to allow them entry. It was connected to a large building that surprisingly looked to be in good condition. Heck, in comparison to some of the buildings it looked like a palace with a neon sign in the shape of a cross hanging off the side of it. Once the door had been lifted, the ambulance moved forward and soon was parked next to two others of the same make and design. However, the previously dark area was suddenly bathed in light as a series of overhead lights clicked on and revealed it to be a spacious area. It had a few shelves lining the walls as well as what appeared to be a toolkit in addition to the two other ambulances. There was enough room to walk around and even walk between the vehicles. The walls, which were a dull gray, looked to be made out of a thick sturdy brick and blended with the ceiling, which had a series of long lamps set into it. To the right of the ambulance sat a pair of doors that looked to be swing doors similar to what his school had on the kitchen, with tiny round windows set near the top. Dr. Thompkins pulled the vehicle to a stop, switching the ignition off with a quick flick of her wrist before she released herself from her seat belt and exited. Harry sat there for a moment, a mix of confusion and nervousness making him slightly jumpy as he stared at the door where she had climbed out. He heard a metallic click from behind and guessed that the back doors had been opened as the murmuring of voices could be heard. Turning again, he managed to look out the window in time to spot the previously noted swinging doors opening to admit a large dark-skinned woman and thin balding man in a lab coat, both of whom quickly made their way to the back of the ambulance. More murmuring was heard before the sound of thumping, and then the woman and the man passed the weird bed with the old man between them and the young man who had been earlier identified as Tom bringing up the rear. Harry stared for a moment, his eyes fixed on the still body of the elderly man, the balding doctor momentarily blocking his view as he leaned over to check something, still walking all the while. Not a moment later they were out of view, the swinging door closing behind them with a slight whoosh of air. Harry remained frozen, his aching wrist held loosely within his left hand, forgotten for the moment. It was a sharp knock that brought him back to reality as he turned to see Dr. Thompkins on the other side of his door, her arms folded over her chest. "Are you coming?" Harry stood for a moment puzzled, before almost reluctantly shuffling to follow her, having to nearly jog at points to match the much older woman's pace. Passing through the swinging doors brought them into a packed corridor with people rushing by every few seconds, some wearing nurses' or doctors' uniforms, while the majority who walked at much more subtle pace wore clothes with ragged holes and dirt stains that would automatically win them a lifetime ban from the Dursley household. Harry felt his nervous energy intensify, and suddenly he was reminded of the streets earlier that day, the overwhelming crowds that liked to bounce him around like a pinball. Thankfully, the hallway had enough room to weave in and out of its other users, and he managed to navigate it while trying to keep pace with Dr. Thompkins. The same went for the next hall they passed into, and the next one, and the next one. The somewhat challenging walk would be halted every now and again when a doctor or nurse would approach his guide and relay off some information about a patient or ask advice on what medication or procedure. The people who quite clearly didn't work there would even give wide smile and greetings as she passed, not seeming to really notice Harry as he followed behind her. Finally, after what felt like forever to the 8-year-old, sanctuary was found as Dr. Thompkins led him into a small but, thank the Lord, empty office. It was cramped with a desk and chair set in the center, upon which a mountain of paperwork sat at what appeared to be haphazard angles, next to which was a thin metal lamp, A series of filing cabinets pushed against the east wall with small plastic trays and other even more paperwork piled on top. Opposite the desk sat a red two-person couch that looked like it had seen better day. Even that had bits of paperwork on it. Harry took all of this in within seconds and noted through the half-shut blinds that it was now fully dark outside. He was so late. The doctor, who had allowed him to enter first, closed the door behind them with a small click. And with it went all the noise and hustle and bustle that had permeated the halls. Turning, Harry stared up at the elder woman with no small amount of weariness. She had seemed nice before, but now that he was alone with her, he was reminded of the lessons that had been drilled into him by his first year in school, as well as his brief time passing through the Narrows.
Stranger, danger.
After a moment, Dr. Thompkins was looking down at him in return, though her gaze was not filled with curiosity or weariness. No, her eyes were laced with fatigue as the slight but still visible dark bags below her eyes would certainly attest to. With a slight flick of her hand, she gestured to the couch, the side thankfully not covered in paperwork, and then moved over to her desk and switched the lamp on to allow an amber glow to illuminate the small room. Sit on the couch and I'll give that wrist a look over. Harry stared at her back, standing in place and debating his options silently to himself before finally just doing as he was told. His wrist was really throbbing. Sitting down, he allowed his bag to slide off his shoulder and to the floor, noting that his feet were barely touching the floor due to his height. That earned his feet and legs a glower. They swung innocently in return. Glaring at them won't help them grow. Looking up, he found that the doctor had moved from the desk to kneeling before him in the time he had been cursing his small body. A slight, and mind you, it was only slight, tingle of amusement in her eyes. It was gone in a moment, and then she was extending her palm to him, expectant. Blushing at having been caught, he offered his wrist up with only a brief hesitation, his embarrassment overriding his fear for the moment. He had nothing to worry about, as she gently took the wrist in his own hand, using the fingers from the other to run lightly over the injured flesh. After a moment, she seemingly came to some conclusion and had reached for something on the ground, before placing it on his wrist. An instant biting cold seeped into the flesh, and almost instantly Harry gave a small hiss in return, finding a small ice pack wrapped in a towel was being held there. Hush, you'll be fine. Luckily that lummox Bullock only managed to bruise your wrist. It will be back to normal in a day or two. She explained in that matter-of-fact kind of way only doctors, lawyers, and politicians could. Harry nodded in return. A small thank you was murmured out before he resumed his silence. Looking at his wrist, his mind instantly provided an image of the man, the tall, intimidating officer who scarily enough kind of reminded Harry a bit of Dudley. A shiver traveled down his back at the thought, and he found himself speaking before he had even realized he had opened his mouth. Why was he like that? I mean, I didn't do anything wrong, did I? Doubt was coursing through him by the end, and he was trying to think back, trying to remember if he had in fact been at fault somehow. Maybe he had done something he shouldn't have, and that's why the man had gotten so mad. The question was rewarded with a snort of surprised amusement from the doctor, who leaned back slightly, eyeing Harry now with a cocked eyebrow. You don't have to do anything wrong to get Harvey Bullock angry at you. Ask any one of the gangs, or anyone on the police force for that matter. He just has a really bad temper. She fell silent for a moment, then upon seeing Harry's confused frown she sighed slightly before elaborating. Look, you didn't do anything wrong. Bullock just doesn't like to be showed up or outdone, especially when it comes to a Batman case. He really has problems dealing with the police force and Batman working together. Rather than help, this information only confused Harry more, his frown deepening slightly. But why? Batman always helps the police, and he always takes down the bad guys. Just last year he saved the mayor at that big Christmas party. A slight wry smile was given this time, and Dr. Thompkins briefly broke eye contact to glance down at his wrist. You're a fan of Batman, I take it? Harry gave a small nod in confirmation, also giving his wrist a quick glance before settling his gaze upon the doctor once more. Not surprising, really. She went on, shifting the pack slightly so it lay at a different angle. Most of you kids today love him, but there are some who don't appreciate what he's doing. Some who don't agree with his methods or his apparent lack of respect for the laws he breaks on a nightly basis. Bullock just happens to be one of them. Finally, Dr. Thompkins met his gaze once more, face and expression carefully guarded even as she eyed him up. Oh, to be a child, she murmured almost longingly. Your world is so black and white. His actions are not always so positive. Most of the time he's beating up people or jumping off rooftops. And in some cases his actions lead people into danger rather than away from it. Batman is not perfect, and like one of us here on this earth, he has friends and enemies. And he can make mistakes like anyone. By the time she finished, her tone had become much more personal, and a slight hint of anger could be seen flickering in her eyes. After a moment she appeared to calm slightly and had brought her gaze back to his wrist, lifting the pack to look it over before placing it down once more. His actions can have negative consequences, the same as everyone else. A silence descended upon them, and Harry found himself looking away, his thoughts buzzing inside his mind. He didn't understand. Batman helped people, so what if he made a few mistakes? It didn't change anything. He still helped people. He still jumped into danger and put himself before others. It was these thoughts that led him to voicing a response. You're wrong. Now it was the doctor's turn to look confused, and she paused, her eyes meeting his once more. Oh, he puts other people's lives before his own. He jumps into danger without a second thought. Before, while I was hiding behind a dumpster trying to psyche myself up, he was beating up a gang and saving that old man. He would probably be dead right now if Batman hadn't intervened. Passion had flown through Harry like a raging wave, and his voice gained momentum as he argued. He was fine with his aunt and uncle hating his hero, calling him a freak the same as they did Harry. That didn't truly bother him because they did the same to anyone slightly different to them. But having other people like the police or even this doctor think such, people who were supposed to be grateful for his help, it left him seething. Dr. Thompkins was silent for a moment, face expressionless and eyes far too old and knowing, staring with a wisdom that was intimidating. Let me ask you? She drifted off, and Harry caught onto her meaning. Harry, have you ever heard of Robin? A confused look was all the answer she needed. I thought not. You're what? 7? 8? You would have only been around 2 or 3 when he died. What was this lady talking about? What did this have to do with Batman? Cocking an eyebrow, Harry cocked his head slightly to the right. I don't understand. Dr. Thompkins held up her hand, indicating he should be quiet. Batman didn't always work alone. At times he would have a partner. That partner was Robin, the boy wonder. She watched as the boy's eyes widened slightly in amazement, his full attention given to her as his wrist was held forgotten between the two of them. He was a little boy like you who Batman inspired and trained to fight alongside him. For years they worked together fighting crime, until one day Robin was caught by one of Batman's enemies. She fell silent, her eyes looking far away for a moment. That little boy was no different from you. Batman was his hero. And following the example Batman set, he put his own life in danger. A slight rap at the door startled both of them. Well, more Harry. The other appeared to be more irritated, drawing the doctor away. As she stood, she turned to give Harry a slight stern look and a brief "stay here and keep that on your wrist." And then she was gone, the sounds and light of the hallway invading momentarily before being blocked off once again. Harry stared at the door for a moment before glancing over the office once more, his thoughts abuzz with shock and confusion. Batman had a partner? And not only a partner but a little boy who fought by his side? He found himself leaning slightly back into the plush cushions of the couch, ice pack still firmly held to his wrist even as he felt it throb in rebellion. Eyes looking over everything but not truly seeing. His daydreams of running across rooftops, of saving the day flashing before him. He was staring at what he could see of the dark sky outside, thoughts moving too fast for him to truly process when the door to the office finally opened once again and admitted Dr. Thompkins. He snapped out of his daze and was sitting at attention once more, eyes open and fixed on the doctor who had made her way to the desk, which she promptly leant against, one hand rubbing almost furiously against her shut lids. After a moment she seemed to remember he was there and was stood straight once more, turning and coming to kneel before him once more. She reached and took hold of the ice pack, lifting it from his wrist and examining it once again, her eyes only this time. Then with a brief satisfied nod she stood, tossing the pack onto the cluttered desk. That should do it. It'll bruise of course, but that's taken the swelling down at least. Thanks, Harry mumbled. An awkward silence promptly fell, and neither appeared to know what to say. And then Harry's mind flashed back to the old man, laid out strapped to the bed with wheels. How is he? He had asked the question without conscious thought, and felt a bit stupid, but he looked up to meet her eyes. Dr. Thompkins stopped for a moment, seemingly confused. Then, with a slight dawning look and her lips pursed into a harsh line, she answered, "He'll be all right." Thankfully the beating was halted in time, that he only got a few broken bones for his trouble. Could have been a lot worse. Harry smiled slightly, relief washing over him at the news. He was going to be all right. Batman had saved him. Then Harry felt slightly stupid, because of course Batman had saved him. Batman saved everyone. Dr. Thompkins sighed once more before resettling her gaze on Harry. Right, we best be getting you home. I'm sure that your parents are worried sick about you. Do you have a number I can call to let them know what's happened? Harry froze, shrinking slightly in his seat before shaking his head. No, I don't know the number. He wasn't sure why he lied, why he didn't just come right out and say, not unless you have a phone line that can connect to the afterlife or something similar, and most likely more subtle than that. But an odd sense of shame had fallen over him. Like the fact that he had no parents somehow put him at fault. It wasn't a new emotion, so to speak. He had similar instances before, but never so striking. Dr. Thompkins shot him a suspicious glance. Eyes narrowed as if she knew that he had been lying, but she did not push the issue. Instead, she gestured for him to follow her as she headed for the door. Harry stood, pulling his bag onto his shoulder once more, his wrist being protectively enveloped in his left hand once more. Harry took a deep breath and then followed. The halls had died down a bit, thankfully, and Harry managed to walk just behind her as they set about into the confusing maze of halls. It was similar to before, with doctors, nurses, or even patients stopping Dr. Thompkins every now and again until they reached a pair of swing doors. Passing through them, Harry noticed that they were now in a garage similar to the one they had arrived in earlier. Only this one was larger and filled with cars rather than ambulances. She pointed to an old blue beat-up Ford a few feet away. A man could be seen in the driver's seat, but Harry couldn't make out his features. "Tom is going to give you a lift home now. Please remember to put some ice on your wrist tomorrow and not do anything too strenuous with it until it's healed." "Ok," Harry replied. Dr. Thompkins gave him a slight smile and then turned to head back into the hospital. But as he watched her go, curiosity bubbled up within him once more, and he couldn't restrain one last question that was poking and prodding at him with an unnerving intensity. "Dr. Thompkins?" She had only gone a few feet before pausing, looking over her shoulder to meet his gaze once more. What happened to him? To Robin? Her eyes darkened and a spark of something he could not quite make out appeared. Then she looked away and began walk away once more. He was murdered. That's what happens when you fight crime in Gotham. Crime fights back.
Stříška.
There were times when Ethan Bennett questioned every decision he had ever made. Questions like, why did he stay in Gotham of all places? Why did he become a cop when the pay sucked and the danger was almost triple every other city in America? Why did he have to deal with an idiot like Harvey Bullock on a daily basis? The latter question was the one that was really bugging him at the moment. And then this idiot marches in and just tells me to release the suspect. Bennett scoffed, rolling his eyes in exasperation. Suspect? He was a kid, for Christ's sake. Commissioner, he couldn't have been older than 7 from the looks of him, and Bullock here believes that he was their secret leader. Adding quotation marks for effect was a nice touch in his own opinion, emphasizing just how stupid Bullock truly was. Who the hell do you think you are? Last time I checked, Bennett, I was the senior detective, and I know how to do my own damn job without some rookie telling me how to run an investigation. Bullock returned fire and spittle in one go, a finger jabbing out to prod at Ethan's chest, face twisted into a fierce scowl. And last time I checked, Chrome Dome, you didn't even take a statement from him. A statement? Why the hell do you want a statement? We have a victim who will be fine to testify. All right. Cut it out, the pair of you. The heated debate settled for a second, both their eyes swiveling to meet their superiors. The red-headed man was stood before his own desk, left hand currently massaging his forehead as if attempting to rub away an impending headache. We're supposed to be a well-functioning unit, and all the two of you can do is argue like a pair of kids over a toy. What if the press had been there? Is that the message you want to send to the citizens? That we're too busy fighting amongst ourselves to do our jobs properly? Bullock. Bullock stood at attention, scowl being replaced with an irritated mask. Bennett was on scene first, he therefore takes priority as lead detective. Bennett. His attention turned to the youngest male in the room, face just as stern. You've been on the force long enough to know that every statement can be vital. You should have questioned the kid at the very least. Sighing, Gordon rubbed his hands over his face, moving them so they ran through his flaming red hair. To be honest, both of you have let me down tonight. I expect better of my team. If anything like this happens again, you'll both be losing a week's pay. Both looked away, Bennett in shame. Bullock, it was harder to judge whether it was out of shame or indigestion. Ethan crossed his arms over his chest, looking back toward his boss as he spoke. Sorry, Commissioner. It won't happen again. Yeah, sorry. Just got caught up in the moment, Bullock muttered along, but didn't look at either of them. Sighing, Gordon turned and walked around his desk to take his seat. Fine. Now go home, the pair of you. You were supposed to clock off 10 minutes ago, and I don't think I'm in the mood for any more drama tonight. Yes, Commissioner, Ethan said before turning and exiting the office, not waiting to hear what Bullock had to say. Quite frankly, he'd had enough of the man to last him 1,000 lifetimes. The guy had no impulse control whatsoever, and the brain capacity of a dog. Bullock got the job done, but his methods, well, they're somewhat lacking in the area of following the rules or applying common decency to a case. He had come close to seriously hurting that kid earlier, losing his rag and taking it out on the nearest target. And why had he lost his rag? Because Batman had saved the day. And then Bennett had taken the bust. And like the oaf he couldn't comprehend the fact that he was just not needed. Bennett had come close to shooting him earlier when he had caught him dragging Harry towards his patrol car, the kid crying all the while struggling to pull his wrist loose. He had looked terrified, and no statement or not Bennett could see all too clearly that the kid had nothing to do with the whole mess. He had just been passing by at a bad time and got himself caught up in a bad situation. He hadn't deserved to be terrorized by Bullock. Hell, the kid had tried to help a stranger. And wow, that was a true rarity in Gotham. Hell, it was even more amazing that it had happened in the Narrows of all places, the one place where you know to keep your head down or suffer the consequences. Thinking back to all that had happened earlier that night, he scowled slightly, remembering how the kid had reacted. He had been unprepared for the sudden stiffening as well as the tension the boy held in his frame as he was carried. Usually when he picked up a child it served to comfort them, however the boy appeared to be extremely uncomfortable. That was odd, however he had seen cases of it before, particularly in abuse cases. Unconsciously he had started to note down facts as he had moved to follow the Leslie. The boy was heavier than he looked but lighter still than he should have been. He could feel the light muscles that lined the frame through the overly large shirt the boy wore, as well as a few ribs and a very flat stomach. That would imply that the boy hadn't eaten today, and while not exactly the most obvious sign of abuse, it could in fact be a sign. In addition to everything else, the boy looked overall frail. And Bennett said looked because he knew that it was in fact just that. Looks. The way the boy had held himself and the ready position as well as startled looks showed that he had been bullied and wasn't particularly used to affection. However, the light muscles suggested that he could at the least run. While his actions tonight as well as the intent to help the man suggested that he was prepared to fight. A complete conundrum if Bennett had ever seen one, and his assessment was not really helping. He could tell that the kid idolized Batman like many of those who lived in the city just from the look on his face when he had asked him to look after the Batarang, and what an inspired moment that had been. He had needed to distract the boy from the victim, knowing that there had been a good chance the man could have died. He really had no intention of letting a child watch that, and it had served its purpose well enough. Besides, old bats surely wouldn't miss one of them. He had left it behind in the first place. As he collected his coat, Bennett couldn't help but pause, his eyes glancing out the nearby window to take in the pitch-black sky. The boy playing on his mind, the child nearly cowering under the gaze of Bullock. Yet the bravery and downright stupidest as he ran into the road and was nearly plowed down by the fast-moving police vehicle. That boy had reminded him of someone. But who?
Strishka.
Harry waved slightly as the car drove away, Tom giving a minute one in return before turning the corner and leaving Harry's line of sight, heading to the house. Giving Shaggy a quick scratch behind his ear when he wandered over to sniff him, He nuzzled into the hand and then with a quick brief lick and then headed over to his usual spot. Harry smiled slightly, his nervous energy lessening before he decided to just face his fear and entered the house. He was greeted with absolutely nothing. Looking around the dark hall, he stood baffled for a moment before he started looking through all the rooms on the bottom floor. Finally entering the kitchen, he spotted a note on the table. Boy, gone out for dinner, leftover meat loaf in the fridge. Wash up once you're finished. The handwriting told him that it was Vernon who had written the note, and now Harry felt only exasperation. He had gotten himself worked up for absolutely nothing. Typical. Sighing, he put the note down before turning and heading upstairs. It had been a long day and his thoughts were abuzz with the image of a bat as it took flight, shadowy figures on rooftops, and a little bird, rarely seen in Gotham these days. Reaching into his pocket, his hand found cool metal and a slight content smile made its way to his face. He still had his sandwiches from lunch. They trumped meat loaf any day.